Good evening all and welcome, and thank you all so much for being here. It means a lot that you choose to watch this channel. I have a chilling collection of scary stories in the rain for you to enjoy, but for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. My story takes place nearly 2 years ago, about 5 miles off the coast of Ozette, Washington. Me and my dive partner at the time, Jay, were both certified rescue divers with multiple advanced specialities, as well as soon-to-be dive masters, through the International PADI program. I should preface, I was 23 years old at the time while Jay was 24. The spot we chose was known by a few locals as a relatively uncharted piece of reef along a steep ravine with strong currents and very cold waters. I was also told that there were many semi-cavernous areas that were pristine for incredible underwater photography, all of which sounded incredible to Jay and I. For those divers listening, Jay and I were both certified cavern divers, deep water divers, and digital underwater photographer divers, so we had a very good idea of what we were doing. After beginning our dive and slowly making our way deeper into the relatively clear water, we came to a point around 40 to 50 meters where, if you didn't have the proper enriched oxygen mixture within your air tanks, it can result in such significant difficulties, including nitrogen narcosis, referred to as the bends. Now, narcosis can affect people differently. It can manifest as drunkenness, disorientation, or the worst, panic. Jay and I had been beyond this point of 40 to 50 meters many times before and had always packed the right air tanks and equipment necessary to have a successful dive. However, this one was different. We had planned to start our ascent when our cookies, the air pressure gauges, read 1000 psi, 800 for going up, 100 to decompress, and another 100 just in case anything happened. Nearly 19 minutes in, we began to quickly approach the 1000 psi mark, and I went to signal Jay that it was time to go up. We always dived no more than 5 odd meters apart, and had underwater audio devices to alert each other if we needed to get the attention of the other. When I turned to signal Jay, he had somehow drifted downwards nearly 8 to 9 meters from the last time I checked his position 30 seconds ago. I buzzed my underwater audio device to get him to look at me, but he didn't look up. We were on the edge of a very deep ravine, and Jay and I typically end our dives at the same air pressure, so if I was nearing 1000 psi, he must have almost been there too. At this point I was more pissed than worried. He knew that staying within 5 meters was a must for diving with a partner, and breaking that rule is when bad situations can happen. So after a few more times buzzing, I took out my emergency flashlight. This son of a gun could shoot a beam a good 30 meters down with ease, so I was certain Jay would be able to see it. But it didn't. He didn't look up. Now I began to get worried. The beam of light was hitting the back of his head, his hands, his regulator. I even caught his cookie, which had a little reflector on it. Jay also began to act weird at this point, swimming hard down without controlling his bouncy for a few moments before freezing and gradually floating back up for a few meters. He did this a few times before I decided to descend down towards him. I got around 2 to 3 meters short of Jay before he spun around abruptly, with his eyes wide. He took out his regulator, smiled, and waved at me, and began to swim as hard as I've ever seen a human swim, straight down into the ravine, until I couldn't see him anymore. I was beyond words. I just sat there, looking into the darkness, beside myself with what the hell just happened. After a minute, I hesitantly beeped my underwater audio device a few times, trying to hold out some hope, before slowly beginning my ascent. I hadn't realized that I was panting and managed to suck 200 psi out of my tank without even realizing it. I knew that what I saw was real, and there was no way in hell I would put my own life in danger going after someone who was clearly going to die, if not dead already, with such little air. Upon safely resurfacing, I immediately started towards the boat, in a panic of course, after the severity of the situation hit me. Long story short, Jay hadn't packed the right oxygen tank and had experienced a severely delayed narcosis episode that resulted in him just answering the call of the abyss, as some guys call it. I was very close with him, and I had to run through hoops with the police and other investigators during the investigation of his death. They never claimed I murdered him, but they implied it multiple times during questioning. But following the retrieval and subsequent autopsy of his body, it was shown that the cause of death was directly linked to massive nitrogen toxicity. I've recounted this story many times, yet the nightmares still come. The one question I'll always have is, what was going through his mind when he took out his regulator and descended into the depths? I went to college in Moorhead, Kentucky, and this was back in 2017. There was this old mining cave system called the Mushroom Mines. They aren't used anymore, but it's a hot spot for spooks and exploring. People always say crazy stuff goes down there, like rituals, but I only believe the occasional drug deal or something. Someone said police found a goat cutting half down the center of its face, but I never saw evidence of that, so I don't believe it. Anyway, my friend Teddy and my boyfriend at the time decided to go to the caves around 2 or 3 p.m. one afternoon after class. I can't remember who, but I think we had 1 or 2 other friends with us. Maybe Teddy's friend, because I honestly can't remember. When we got there was another car parked outside the caves, and it seemed like it didn't belong to anyone crazy. It was a lime green little thing, clean as what we could see with the windows rolled down, maybe because it was hot, and they didn't want to turn on the AC. No one was around. That wasn't really weird though, because there are a lot of hiking trails next to the cave. No one was in the mouth of the cave, so we assumed they must have been hiking. As we were exploring the mouth of the cave, going about 10 to 20 feet deep, because if you've been in a mine or a cave that isn't in use anymore, you know it's pitch black and cold. We had flashlights, but weren't exactly wanting to go in miles or anything. When out of the blue, Teddy asks if we saw something. This immediately sent a chill down my spine, and I instantly assume he's just trying to scare us. My boyfriend goes to where he's standing and asks what he saw. As Teddy is explaining that he thinks he saw a small light come from down the cave, way deeper down, the small light clicks on, way further than we are down in the cave, as if reacting to his acknowledgement. It was a light from a flashlight. It clicks back off, and we take a second, and we get the hell out of there. So guys, I don't know what the hell to think at all. They didn't have their own light when we first showed up. So what were they? Just hanging out down there in the dark. They didn't say hi to us or speak out at all. It's just weird. It seems like they almost tried to get our attention instead of just calling out and greeting. They also had no idea that we were coming. We had all skipped our afternoon classes, and most students or working people probably wouldn't be there till about 5 or 6. I'd love to hear what you guys think. Obviously, I haven't gone back since. I was driving from Tucson to Denver in the middle of the night. Got tired and was pulling off and crawl in a sleeping bag in the desert, far away from the two-lane blacktop. I was on Highway 666. It's since been renamed because everyone was sealing their signs. Anyway, I pull off the road onto a dirt road, and then a little further. I kind of hid the truck behind some vegetation and tossed down a sleeping bar and pad in the middle of the pitch-black, huge New Mexico starry night. There was no one around, no light, nothing at all. Hardly any visibility for miles. I'm completely alone in the pitch darkness. Nothing. And getting wound down, my eyes getting droopy. That's when I hear it. It sounds goofy to say, but it's the same Indian music you hear in old black and white westerns. Native music, voices and drums. I literally think I'm dreaming. And when it starts, I'm petrified because that noise is just appearing out of nothing, and it simply put ice into my veins. I relax a little and unfreeze, and try to be logical about what I'm hearing, which has no physical manifestation of its origin. So I'm thinking logically, and instead of pure panic, it could be that I'm at a reservation. Perhaps it's coming behind a previously unseen hill. I get up and look around and don't see anything. It kind of comes and goes in volume. It doesn't seem to be coming from a direction. I'm clueless. I look for evidence and don't find anything. I crawled back into the bag because I'd been driving for hours, and they sang all night. Logic tells me it had to be a group of people I didn't see, but I looked, and there were no ancillary noises like talking or stopping or anything, just that Indian drum, and the hiya that was originally terrifying, and it became calming, and I ended up sleeping fantastically. Later, I learnt that there was a terrible stretch of road for very bad things to happen. It sort of lived up to its 666 moniker for wrecks and bad stuff occurring, apparently. About 5 years ago, I set out to travel the world. I was a 26-year-old male. Being straight out of college had left me in debt, ever more desperate for any job I was overqualified for, and generally depressed. I felt isolated and alone in my small town in Washington, and found the only way to get out: travel. My high school buddy suggested I look into woofing and volunteered as a way to travel cheap, and so I did. The way it works is quite simple. You work for around 25 hours a week on some farm for food and housing. The draw is that since the community of cheap-ass travelers is quite big, it is a great way to meet new people, get outside your comfort zone, and just let yourself live and figure life out. Fast forward 8 months. I am now a seasoned cowpatch shoveler. I started out in Washington, Oregon, and went to South California from there. I was able to save some money and was paid under the table for some extra work, and was now faced with a decision: where to go in the world. The excitement of being able to purchase a ticket to almost anywhere in the world got the best of me, and on the advice of my dumbass hippie volunteering partner, I chose at random. I went to the randomizer website and clicked the country button. Georgia. The country of Georgia. To say I didn't know anything about it was an understatement, but the fear of the unknown made it exciting and exotic somehow, and so I did it. I purchased a ticket and started browsing for a farm that could host me. There were a few options, and most were remote and hadn't even an internet connection. I messaged every single one because few ever responded, and got a response from one on top of a mountain. The pictures showed a traditional Georgian stone house with a large garden out back, a family with several cheerful children, grandparents having dinner, animals, and it seemed warm and inviting. The description was written in good English, and the requirements for work seemed reasonable. I was excited. After I flew into Tbilisi, the capital, I followed the directions that they had sent me to locate the farm, which wasn't an easy task. Few in Georgia speak English. The roads are messed up and have been for a while, and not been maintained since the fall of the Soviet Union, and the country is generally poor. It took me around 20 hours of Soviet buses and taxis, weird serpentine roads and paths to get to that desired blue pin on my map. It was a dirt path leading up a steep hill into a national park, up in the north of the country. There was nothing for miles on end but trees and silence, and as I got up the hill, I saw the house about a half-mile away on an even steeper hill surrounded by the trees. From that viewpoint it seemed abandoned, overgrown, brown and dreary. I walked past the gate. Giri, the apparent owner, approached me. He was a heavy, small, middle-aged guy with a big smile on his face. He shook my hand and in broken English began to show me around. He also smelled of booze. As he was showing me around, I noticed that there wasn't anyone around there but us. I asked about his wife and kids, and he brushed that aside and said something to the extent, "They're away right now." By this point, I'm creeped out. From browsing around, it was apparent that the farm was in deep decline. Apple trees and crops were dying. The roof of the small barn caved in, the house itself full of trash and smelling of mold. It was obvious that Giri was going through a rough patch. But I wasn't going to turn around and just leave in the middle of nowhere, without a plan and not having slept for the last 36 hours. It was evening, and after feeding me well and trying his best he could to hold the conversation in English, Giri showed me to my room on the second floor, and I went to sleep. I almost immediately blacked out from stress and exhaustion, and would have slept for 10 hours if I wasn't awoken by a strange noise in the middle of the night. It sounded like something metallic and heavy was being dragged across the wooden floor. In that sleepy in-between state, I listened to it for a few minutes, thought nothing of it, and went back to sleep once it had stopped. In the morning, Giri, now sober and grumpy, asked me to repair some of the windows and doors in the house, as he himself planned to go fetch some components in a nearby village. Again, I got this weird feeling creeping down my spine. Something wasn't right. He didn't maintain eye contact and was evasive. There was no cell reception, no internet, and once he left, I checked around the house to get a general idea of the place, and it became apparent the place was hardly ever lived in, like one of those abandoned houses where the broken furniture, newspaper, and old photos on the floor and a shattered mirror were. I took my phone and looked through the saved listing again. The photos didn't match neither the backyard, the garden, or the walls. Giri wasn't in any of them. It was a completely different house. Now by this point I am full-blown panicking. I packed my stuff and started to leave when I see a group of 3 men coming up the first hill. There aren't any other paths I can take, so I go behind the house and rush down this hill into the forest. After some time I stop and listen. I hear them at the house and they're clearly looking for me. Afraid of making any noise, I remain still, hidden behind a bush. I didn't know how long I wait, but they were persistent. At some point I hear them leave, so I count until some large number and proceed back into the house and path. And once I find it's clear, I book the hell out of there. I've never ran so fast, but I'm still in the middle of nowhere, no traffic, no public transport, and I reached a paved road and start walking in the general direction from where I remember coming. Hours go by, and finally a car drives by and stops. Now, in the horror movies, this would have been Giri and his friends, but this was actually a really nice Russian family that gave me a ride to town. The listing disappears from the website in a few days after I left, and I haven't heard from Giri since. I've yet to make sense of this experience. I have traveled since and volunteered too. Some people, once they hear this story, laugh and say the guy was coming over with a few friends from the village to have a chat or a few beers. Some say he was bound to kidnap me and kill me. But I trust my gut feeling. Something was really not right. So Giri, let's never meet again. This happened nearly 20 years ago. I don't remember how old I was, but probably between 5 or 6. We used to live in a city right next to the ocean, and this happened in Germany. During the summer, my family would go to the beach to enjoy ourselves, and me and my best friend Jonas were just exploring the area around the beach and being little kids. There was this huge bush that you could go into. It might sound strange, but try to imagine a bush about 20 to 30 feet high, thick sides and hollow on the inside so kids could always go in there and play. Me and my friends went in there and were just joking around, fighting with branches and stuff like that. That's when we noticed a shadow outside the bush heading towards the entrance. Me and my friend didn't think anything of it and just kept playing. The shadow kept walking and eventually reached the opening. It was an old man in his 60s, and he was smiling at us, talking with us. We're basically trapped in the bush and start freaking out since we weren't supposed to talk to strangers, and here was this old guy trying to talk to us. He asks us stuff like where we're from and where our parents were, and that's when my friend lost it and booked it through the bush. That's when the guy's smile fades and changes to an angry face and he charges at me. I follow my friend's example and we run to get my parents. We told them what happened and they stopped allowing us to go back there. We kept going to the beach for a few weeks and I could always see the guy in the distance looking at me and my buddy. Fast forward a few weeks and there's a huge lifeguard building with toilets. My friend goes to pee and I go with him because I want to buy some ice cream. My friend goes to the restrooms, which are about 20 feet down the hall from the snack bar. I buy my ice cream and wait for him, and that's when I heard a scream. I run to the bathroom and rip open the door, and there is just one stall. The door is open, and the same old guy that had been stalking us is standing inside the stall door, and I can see my friend in the stall crying in the corner. That door behind me has shut. The guy sees me and starts yelling and looking like he's about to kill someone. I hurry to open the door and storm out to get help as I scream as loudly as I can, and a few lifeguards run over. I pointed at the door and they went in. They got the guy and the police were called. Me and my friend had to make statements, and my friend was in therapy for a few months but is alright now. Turns out the guy was a known child molester, but the police had no evidence to lock him up until then. I live in southwest Spain, near a really ancient forest, which has some kind of trees that are almost extinct and only grow here and in a few other places. It's a bit of a rocky terrain, and if you ever are walking on the forest and try to climb some rocks, you should really be careful, because usually there can be caves and hollow spaces under your feet, and it's quite easy to fall to your death. My father and his friends usually go hiking on Thursdays, so they don't find anyone in the woods besides maybe a shepherd or a forest worker. And on this day they decided to climb a really large and rocky hill. My uncle Frank remembered that when he was young he slept on a little cave and went hunting and got lost, and they wanted to try and find that cave. A few hours later, they find it. It was covered in moss and grime, but it was surely the same one. One of my father's friends, John, tried to go as far as possible into it, because he was in really good shape and wanted to see it. John went in. The rest of them waited outside. Suddenly, John began screaming and calling for my father. He went in and turned on his torch. Inside the cave was a really weird shrine, with candles, 2 apples, bones, pieces of coal and ash on the ground, a pair of gloves, a pot, a pan. Everything looked really old and dusty. It was clear it hadn't been used in a long time. My father went to the shrine. It had a little bowl, and when he looked inside there was something that appeared to be human teeth in it. When they got out, they packed up all their things and got the hell out of there really fast. My father refused to hike around the area anymore, and they started hiking on the other side of the hill and into the woods. All of this was really strange, and I'd never heard of anything like this before. I don't know anything about voodoo or this kind of thing, but my father said it looked like some voodoo shrine. If anyone has any idea what it could be, I'd appreciate enlightenment. I was driving across the country with my friend. At this junction, we're at North Dakota. It had been a long day with lots of driving. At this point it was 1 a.m. and I had awoken from my nap, my back killing me. Hey man, let's call it a night. My back's killing me. Let's go grab a hotel. Alright, we'll get off at the next exit. We're driving, there's nothing around. Just nothingness. Eventually we grab the next exit and after a little drive we spot a hotel. There's some road construction going on around it and some of the roads were closed. We tried driving up to it, but every intuitive path is fenced off. Now the hotel was more or less right in front of us, so we drive there, and it's kind of a dirt gravel road that went into a thicket of trees. About 500 yards down this road, there is a bright light. This road is the complete opposite direction of the hotel and the main road. Remembering there's nothing around but this one hotel and infinite fields and trees, it's also like 1:30 a.m. and completely dark. We keep driving around, unable to get the hotel, when my friend just drives towards the light on the dirt road, which is barely wider than the car. I instantly get a bad feeling. This makes no sense. Why is there a light at the end of this dark, dirt road? Dude, what are you doing? This is like bugs flying to a light. Turn around. I will once I find a spot. I don't exactly have the space. Okay, that makes sense. The road was narrow and kind of dropped off on each side. Anyway, he kept driving closer to the light, which I thought may have been a generator light for construction. As we get closer, it's a huge flatbed truck with its high beams on. As we realize this, we are also blinded by the brightness. I thought these people have us exactly where they want us. I'm shielding my eyes and my buddy is slowly driving to pass the behemoth of a truck, when the blinding light of the high beams is interrupted by someone walking in front of them, and then our car. My friend hits the brake. The figure walks up, and my friend rolls down the window a little. It's a well-dressed guy. My friend goes, "Oh hey, we're just trying to get to the hotel over there, but there's all that construction." "Oh yeah, the hotel's the greatest, just follow us and we'll get you there." "Great, thanks." The interaction was pleasant enough. My friend rolls up the window and drives past the truck. As he's driving past with the window not all the way up, the guy outside calls another guy. "Get in the truck." I see some guy from the shadows toss a cig and walk up to the passenger side. We have to get out of here now. I know, man, I'm working on it. At this point we're doing a 15-point turn in the dark on a road in the middle of nowhere. We get turned around and the truck is driving slowly and in the middle of nowhere, intentionally taking up the whole path. I'm bumbling on about how this makes no sense and we need to escape, when all of a sudden the truck slams on its brakes and both guys simultaneously jump out and start running towards us. The guy on my side has a shotgun. My friend didn't miss a beat and just floored it, and we went flying off the little drop-off to the side of the road. We sped all the way back to the road, got back on the highway, and made sure we weren't followed and went to the next town. Sleep was not good that night. This happened to me back in college. I was maybe 20 or 21. I'm 27 now. It was a number of years ago. I had just moved into the trailer my father had bought me. It was a little trailer park out in the boonies where my cousin also lived, and the neighbors were all family friends. This occurred in southwest New Mexico. Anyway, I was living in this trailer with no electricity. The company hadn't been out yet, but I had water, a lantern, and I liked camping anyway. And as a poor college student, I had peanut butter, so that's what I had for dinner, along with bread. I went to bed and fell asleep fine, and woke up somewhere between 2 to 3 a.m. that night in the most pain I've ever been in. I'm talking 10 of 10, ready to call an ambulance. And there in the corner of the room was this tall, thin, lady. It looked like something was wearing a lady's skin. She had thick, curly black hair which was wet, and was wearing some type of white slip. It just stood there in the corner of my room staring at me and smiling. It was not natural. The smile was way too wide while I'm writhing in pain on the mattress. I realize now I probably should have been scared witless, but I was honestly just irritated. And I remember saying, "Lady, I'm sick and don't have time to deal with you, get lost." Then promptly ran past her into the bathroom and vomited for 10 minutes straight. When I came back to my room I was fine, and the thing was gone. To this day I'm not sure if it was actually in my room, or if I hallucinated it. Thoughts? Has anyone else ever experienced anything similar? This happened to me a few months ago, but when it first happened, given how crazy it was, it took me a few weeks to collect myself. It's relevant for me to tell you up front that I'm a military veteran, and I have PTSD and anxiety, as well as a pretty bad case of depression that I'm currently in my 3rd year of. I've read that cognitive behavioral therapy can massively improve PTSD symptoms, and in turn, help to reduce anxiety. So I've been trying various techniques at home. The problem is, my wife and I live in a small 2-bedroom ground floor flat with an upstairs neighbor with absolutely no concept of other people. A jock douchebag type, who's a personal trainer. But he trains at home too, 'cause gains. The kind of guy whose only 2 topics of conversation are protein powder and steamed rice. I'm sure you can imagine the type. Anyway, with that being a constant issue, meditation and quiet mindfulness are just not possible with the constant noise. My solution to do this was to do my normal routine during the day, but take advantage of my insomnia later on at around 11 to midnight. I would put on my coat and my shoes as we live near the beach. I figured I could walk to the beach now that there's pretty much no people around, walk on the sand and be mindful to the sound of the ocean. Sounds nice, doesn't it? It was the first 2 times, but you know what they say, the 3rd time's the charm. I walked to the beach from my home. It isn't that far, maybe a little over a half mile. But once I got there, I would walk to the very end of the beach until you reached the cliffs where there is a World War II artillery gun turret, which was another half-mile-ish. Sometimes I would walk the path up the cliff to the gun and stare out into the blackness of the midnight ocean, which was only broken by the occasional flash of light from the lighthouse. I would sit and listen to the waves crashing against the cliffs. Sometimes I would close my eyes and just concentrate on nothing but that sound. I felt safe there, knowing I was alone. Just me and the ocean. Usually, before I turned tail and head home, I would walk down to a small row of benches. They're all marked with plaques in remembrance to someone who came to enjoy the view in times past, although I imagine they came during the day. The benches are close to an old pub that was shut down years ago, and I'd heard the place used to get used as a dogging site or brothel or something back in the day. So when I saw vehicle headlights coming towards the pub, I figured it was some young lad trying to catch potential doggers at it. I sat on the bench and waited for the car to pass me. But as it rounded a bend in the road further up, I was momentarily lit up by the headlights. The headlights of the vehicle went off immediately, and the car went off-road and out of sight for a moment. At this point, I became fully alert and a bit cautious, so I dropped to one knee and ducked behind the bench that I had been sitting on. The vehicle drove past me. It was only maybe 40 feet from me, and as the lighthouse illuminated the vehicle, I could now see it was an old beat-up Land Rover kind of vehicle, with terrible camo painting on the wings. At that moment, someone popped out of the top of the vehicle with a scoped rifle and a big torch. In that instant in my head, I was back in Iraq, and my senses felt razor sharp. I dropped onto my belt buckle and crawled into a patch of long grass adjacent to the benches. Then, I got in a position where I could see them, but they couldn't see me. The guy with the rifle shone his torch at exactly the bench I had been sitting on, then the others, searching for me. He started looking all around him through the scope, looking for where I might have gone. My heart was pounding so hard, I felt as if they could hear it. I held my sleeve over my mouth to muffle the sound of my breathing, but more importantly to try and hide the condensation of my breath. The vehicle started to move to get a better view of the benches, so I began slowly crawling towards the main road, as not only is there a row of houses, but an old stone bus stop I could take hard cover in if they saw me and opened fire. After about 5 minutes of hiding in the long grass, it started to rain, and they were clearly still looking for me, but they were now about 150 feet away. The guy with the rifle was scanning around me with his eyes down the scope, so I waited till he was looking away from me to seize my moment and run for cover. I pushed my hands hard into the wet dirt to launch myself onto my feet, then I sprinted towards the bus stop while throwing some zigzags in, just in case they had seen me. Luckily they hadn't, and I was now far enough away that I could take up my phone and call the police. They were there with a riot van and squad car in 10 minutes, and as I was talking to the officers in the van, they spotted the gunner's vehicle and took off after them. The officers in the squad car stayed behind to talk to me. The rain was coming down in sheets now, and they asked me if I was absolutely sure it was a rifle, and I told them I 100% was. No doubt in my mind at all. The officers both looked at each other, and then one of them asked, "And what exactly is your experience with firearms?" I told them I was ex-army, and have seen my fair share of all kind of firearms. They then asked me what I was doing there after midnight, which is a pretty fair question to be honest. I explained that quite ironically I was taking a mindfulness walk to ease my PTSD symptoms. They were satisfied with that explanation, if not somewhat amused, and told me that the armed response unit was en route. I asked if I needed to stay behind and make a statement, but the officers told me not to bother waiting around, because they most likely wouldn't need to take a statement beyond the call I made, and also, it was absolutely pissing it down with rain, so I should get home and get dry. It was over, but I still felt super weird, and my heart was still thumping hard in my chest. I started the walk home, and then when I was about halfway there, a police helicopter buzzed overhead and settled over the area where I had been sitting on the benches, with the searchlight going. It was right then that it hit me like a shotgun to the chest. That happened. That was real, and it was here. My head started swimming. My heart was pounding twice as hard now, and my legs felt like jelly, and my lungs felt glitchy. I couldn't breathe properly. I dropped to my knees, crying in the street in the pouring rain, the only light coming from a nearby street lamp with a flickering bulb. I was gasping for breath, thoughts flashing in my head, thinking that if I had just stayed still, if I hadn't hunched behind the bench, if I had done any number of things differently, or hadn't, then I could have been gurgling my last breaths alone in the dark, wet and cold, and my wife would have been none the wiser until the following day. I have no idea if they were even there for me, and if they were, how could they know I'd be there? I'd been twice before. It's not like there are animals to hunt there beyond foxes. But why hunt foxes from a vehicle with a rifle and a torch at midnight? I'm not ashamed to say that the experience terrified me. I guess my army training helped me stay alert and stay hidden. But I don't know really. I don't go walking at nights anymore. I have the occasional nightmare about the whole thing. If you're wondering what happened to the guy, and I am too, I called on the phone and spoke to an officer. She was able to find the incident report right away, The officers on scene confirmed they'd seen the vehicle, and they had gone on an off-road pursuit. They said that they had given chase over difficult terrain for as long as they could, and then the vehicle turned off all the lights and made an escape using the dark as cover. The armed response unit was called and patrolled the entire area while the helicopter was dispatched in order to try and locate the vehicle with heat cameras. Both teams were unsuccessful in finding them, as by the time they had arrived on scene they'd gotten away. CCTV was also checked and yielded absolutely nothing. I told her I was sorry if they felt I'd wasted their time, and she told me that as far as they were concerned, I did the right thing. She also said that there had been a few isolated accounts of gunshots having been heard in that area over the last few years, so maybe rethink taking my walk so late at night. I didn't have the energy to explain again why I used to wait until night to go walking, but any advice about avoiding getting shot is good advice. So instead, I just agreed and ended the call. After I'd hung up, I sat for a few minutes going over the whole thing in my head. If this has taught me anything, it's that being hypervigilant isn't always such a bad thing. I'm an avid caver from West Virginia, and there's this cave not far that's been one of my favorites to explore. It's often my go-to cave to take friends to, as well as newcomers to get them into caving, as it's a rather easy, accessible one to get to, and not that challenging, despite being a rather large cave system. The first thing to note is that there's never any wildlife seen in or near the cave, and I've only ever seen very few bats for as large of a cave as it is. The first really strange thing to happen to me and my friends was stumbling across a pentagram made of salt with a dead bird in the middle, circled by some, what seemed to be, freshly burnt out candles. Obviously it was freaky, but we took it to be a prank by some teens or something along those lines. I've always been very comfortable going through this cave and leading treks, but up until now, I've always been with a group of friends. One day, I decided to take my girlfriend though, so just me and her. We didn't make it past the first chamber because I had such an uneasy feeling and just felt like I needed to get out of there. My way of describing the feeling was like one of being watched on steroids. I've been in some sketchy places, but I've never had that sense of dread in all my life. The next thing to happen is when a group of us friends went and stumbled upon a newer-looking jacket far back in the cave that was never there before. I wouldn't have taken it to be so odd. It seemed to be a rather expensive jacket, with no apparent damage or reason to just leave it randomly lying this far back in this part of the cave. There was also no one else around at this time. The next thing to happen was when a group of us friends were exploring, and on the way back, one of my most serious friends just seemed really strange and off. Finally, I asked him if he was good, and he nodded, and quickly told me to just keep moving. Once we got out of the cave, he pulled me aside in private, which is really not like him, but he told me he didn't think it was a good idea to go back in there. I finally convinced him to tell me why, and he told me he swore he saw a person back there. From what he could see, it was a very pale and lanky person. He couldn't quite make it out at first, but he noticed it was following us. He even tried calling out a few times, but we didn't think anything of him doing it at the time, as it's fun to yell and make echoes. After this experience, I convinced the same friend to go back with me, along with our other buddy, to reach an extremely difficult place that I haven't been able to get to yet, seeing as I've been taking newbies. As we arrived at the cave, there was a man and a woman camping nearby who were standing at the entrance. We made friendly conversation and asked if they were going in. They said no and they were just checking it out, so then we continued on. After reaching our goal and being at the dead end of a very tight spot, we laid and rested for a while. Then we heard people. We all heard it at the same time, as we looked at each other and squinted. We couldn't quite make out what they were saying, as it was very distant and echoed, and muffled. But we could clearly make out that it was English, male and female voices, and we heard laughter, water splashing, and we thought it was pretty odd. It was in the morning. We didn't expect anyone else to be around. But there were those two campers, so we figured it must have been them. We were exhausted, and rested for quite a good while, and shut off our lights to save battery. We remained quiet, and as we were resting, and after a while we couldn't hear anything anymore. Then we went ahead and made our way back out of the cave, and as we exited, the man and the woman were still there by the entrance. My friends asked, "So you decided to go in after all?" The man replied, "No, why?" We asked if anyone else had been in or out, and they said they hadn't seen anyone the entire time. At this point we were creeped out, as we all clearly heard voices, but we didn't really talk about it amongst each other. Much later, while I started doing research, I started putting things together in my head, and realized my friend's description as being very Wendigo-esque, and then I recalled how Wendigos are known for being able to imitate human voices to lure their prey, and it creeped me out. I almost wouldn't believe what he said he saw, but if you just understood the person I'm talking about, he's not someone to ever just make up something like that. I hope you found this interesting. I'm not sure whether witchcraft would tie in, but it's definitely worth mentioning that I later talked to another caver friend of mine who, before I could ever mention, told me they had found a pentagram similar to the one I described later in the exact same cave at a different time. I was mountain biking deep in the desert in New Mexico. Terrain was high desert mountain foothills. Think juniper, sand, rocks, grasses, cacti, and lots of hills. That's when we noticed something shiny and flashing periodically, glinting in the sun, at the top of a hill. We decided to stash my bike at the side of the trail and hike up this hill to check it out. When I get to the top, I find a shiny, mylar-looking weather balloon slung over a juniper branch and dangling about a foot off the ground. A massive rattlesnake is lying below the mylar balloon, hissing and lunging and biting at it periodically, causing it to swing around. The thrashing motion of the mylar was catching the sun and causing the glinting that I originally saw. I noped the hell out of there and started traversing back down the hill. On my way down, I noticed what looked like a grey gravel platform built into the side of the hill, just a few 100 meters across from where I was coming down. I traversed over to check it out. Mind you, there are no roads or man-made trails or steps or any other indication that any human or machine has access to this man-made looking platform. As I approach this pile of gravel with a flat top built into the side of this hill, I see a warning sign with more warnings on it than I have ever seen on one sign before. The warning signs included poisonous gases, nuclear hazard, trespassing, toxic substances, landslides, pooling water, and open shaft. Being a dumb teenager, I'm intrigued and decide to check it out. I scramble up to the flat portion of the platform and see an open hole in the ground leading straight down further than the eye can see. This opening is squarish, about 5 feet wide, 5 feet long, with rounded corners and seemingly infinitely deep. Being the oaring explorer/scientist I was at 15, I decided the best way to see how deep it was to pick up a large rock and throw it in the hole. So I pick up a rock and drop it in. Nothing. Probably not that deep, and the rock just landed in some soft sand a few feet down without making a noise. To be sure, I grab another large rock, and this time instead of dropping it, I chuck it straight down as hard as I can. I wait a few more seconds, and finally hear a very satisfying thud. Okay, it's really deep, I'm getting out of there. Then, I start walking down. I hear a second massive thunk. Oh, that first thud must have been the first rock, and I'm only hearing the second one now? This thing must be crazy deep, like a mile at least. I sprint down to my bike, jump on it and bike away as quick as I can. Funny thing is, I went over there a year or so later and couldn't find that shaft again. I think it must have been really well concealed from the trail, because I was looking for it, and I knew where to look, but still never found it. I live in Southwest Oregon. Several years back, I was offered a living situation on 80 acres of forested land as a caretaker. This land is absolutely stunning. It was logged back in the 50s, but everything has grown back since. And fortunately, a few of the old legacy trees were spared. I have made hiking trails out of some of the old deer trails when the poison oak isn't too bad. At times, it seems like paradise. But there has come a sense of uneasiness as well. To put into perspective, I live in an old farm cabin that was built in the 1930s as part of some kind of goat farming outfit. A friend of mine, who was almost like a father to me, has owned the property since the 60s. Said the young man who used to live there was real sketchy. When he first moved into the house, he built a new home elsewhere. All of the house's windows were painted black, and there were a few other odd things about it. The house sits in a box canyon, one way in, one way out, with a neighbor across the street at the end of a half-mile driveway into the canyon. The canyon walls are very steep and heavily forested, with Bureau of Land Management, public lands backing up on all sides of the property boundaries. There are real old, decrepit logging roads up on the Bureau of Land Management's land, but the two access points to these roads are heavily gated up and off limits. I have walked these old roads, as I have made some of my hiking trails up to them, and they're a good place to see wildlife. When I first moved onto the property, it seemed for months I would hear what sounded like metal banging behind my house up in the woods. The area it was coming from is heavily forested, and there are no houses there for dozens of miles. Whatever it was didn't sound like an echo or something of nature. It sounded real close. The friend of mine, the property owner, had said he had heard something similar through the years, and would then contact the Bureau of Land Management authorities to investigate. I'd also heard voices. I was home alone one day and heard people talking outside. My partner wasn't home, and so I called him to let him know what was up. I then went out with my bear mace in my jacket to see what was up. No one was out there. Just a cold day, though everything was oddly quiet. The neighbor would often tell us that she hears people's voices in the woods and yells out to them, but gets no replies, and she would ask if we were in the woods yelling that day, and we most certainly weren't. You also get the feeling of being watched. I know this is just a feeling, and one can brush it off as paranoia, but it's a feeling so strong, like something or someone is watching you from the tree line. My dog also goes off at all hours in a tangent, and when I investigate there is never anything there. A few more times I have come home and he is running around loose. Someone let him out of his play area that I set up for him while I'm away or in town. I also seem to find odd things on my hikes up to the Bureau of Land Management's land. I once found what seemed like an old trash pit from the 70s with old car parts, springs, and a mattress. And really old Coke cans, but there were also baby shoes and women's high heels. Something about it just made me cringe a little. This has all come to a head recently, when a friend of the owner's came to hunt on the property for deer. He's an elderly Native American man who comes every year during the autumn months. He came back this time and said while he was hunting, he went up to the Bureau of Land Management's land and stumbled across some bones. At first he assumed from a distance that they were some long dead animal. Until he got closer, he said they appeared to be the bones from a human hand. He came down and told us this and contacted the authorities. Apparently the authorities also think it's a human hand and are doing further investigations. The voices, the feelings, the metallic banging sounds, the items in the trash pile, the bones, it all doesn't sit right with me. And every evening when I'm walking the property to put my chickens away for the night, I get a real ugly feeling in the pit of my stomach. Maybe it can all be explained rationally, but it doesn't make me feel any better living here. This happened a few years ago, and I had completely forgotten about it until about a month ago. So did my boyfriend, who was present at the time. It happened in July 2012. I'm off with my boyfriend on vacation. He inherited a small house on an island in Brittany in France called Ile-de-Gros, and it's situated a few kilometers off the south coast of Brittany, and you can only get there by ferry. It's pretty small and only a few inhabitants live there all year round, and there's not much to do, but it's quite beautiful and is a great place for a quiet vacation. We like to go for rides during daytime as well as nighttime. One night, on a clear night, doused in moonlight, we went around midnight for a ride on the island, as we were used to doing so. We headed to a beach that borders a family vacation village that is situated in a big curve bordered by a small road. Alongside the road is a strip of grass and sand. When standing on this strip, you have a really nice view of the beach and the sea which lie below. The road and village are situated on some kind of steep cliff. To go down to the beach, you have to walk down sheer narrow stairs situated a few meters away from where we were standing. Caleb, my boyfriend, and I were standing by the road on the strip of sand for like 10 minutes looking down at the sea. I need to point out that it was a calm, clear night and we hadn't seen anyone during our ride. We were walking along the beach for a while and hadn't noticed anything strange, nor signs of human presence on the beach, no night swimmers, and the water was very cold in Brittany, even in the summer. No young people having parties on there, etc. So we were standing on a cliff facing the sea, when suddenly straight ahead of us we saw a human-shaped figure get out of the water and hurry across the beach. I know it's nothing scary so far, except the figure was pitch black, contrasting with the clear sand, and was not reflecting any light, like a dark shadow. Remember, the moon was shining. We first thought it was someone skinny dipping. Problem is, when you're going out of the sea, you first swim to the edge of the sea, then you stand up and walk to the water. The figure gradually walked out, all the time standing tall, as if walking on the bottom of the sea. Moreover, Caleb and I had been looking at the water for a while and never noticed anyone swimming, as if it was totally submerged for at least 10 minutes. At the sight of it, I felt quite uncomfortable, not to say freaked out. So was my boyfriend, who doesn't scare easy. The weirdest part is once the human-shaped figure got out the water, it headed straight ahead to the foot of the cliff where we were standing, but it wasn't walking or running, it was sliding on the sand really fast. A pitch-black human shape, with an indistinguishable face and features sliding fast as hell on the sand, almost gliding, not moving its legs or anything, leaving no trail or footsteps behind. All the time standing tall and human-shaped. It was of average human size and build. We stared at it as silently until we got away a few meters from the foot of the cliff, then without talking decided to get the hell out of there, still with this feeling of dread and fear. We never saw or heard this creature again, and nothing strange happened during the rest of our stay. My boyfriend, however, has witnessed strange things on the island before, but nothing that's related to this. I once found myself in a cave, along with 8 or 9 other people. It was the middle of the Pennsylvania wilderness, and the only entrance was a small hole in the ground. To enter, you had to sit on your ass, grab a tree root, and drop about 7 feet down a steep wall to the floor. We all dropped in, and spent at least half an hour exploring this cave. My friend Dan taps me on the shoulder and whispers, "Dude, look at the ceiling." The ceiling was just high enough above our heads to hide the thousands of spiders crawling around it. We tried to keep quiet about it, because we didn't want anyone to flip out, but there was no stopping it. Just seconds later, the whole group noticed them. Everyone got silent, and you could actually hear the spiders crawling on the surface of the stone. It was an extra nerve-wracking situation, because the only way to exit the cave was to jump up and pull yourself out of a hole surrounded by spiders. 2 of the girls with us were terrified and refused to climb out. They just couldn't muster the courage to put their faces next to a giant spider's nest. They came around though, and everyone got out safe. I had the honor of being the last to exit, alone in a dark cave filled with spiders, and nobody around to give me a boost. Fortunately, Dan was brave enough to reach down and give me a hand. When we first discovered the cave, we were like, I can't believe we've never heard of this place. And now, I know why. A few months later, I found out the cave is off limits in the fall because of the rattlesnakes. I lived out on the high desert for most of my life. 6,000 above sea level, if you're wondering. I was riding my horse alone in the absolute middle of the BFE in the Badlands, with no trees and hardly any brush to speak of. So, sound carries a long way, and there's nowhere to hide for long. When all of a sudden his ears perk up, I feel my skin start to crawl like I'm being watched. My normally mellow gelding starts to panic, and I start to feel really dizzy, and my horse stumbles, and I black out. I come to an hour or so later, about 3 miles away from the inciting incident, still on my horse. He is frothing with sweat and shaking all over. I'm still unsure what happened. I had plenty of water and snacks. It was 65 degrees and breezy. I don't believe weather or dehydration/hunger were a factor. I have never before or after had a fainting spell, and that was the most reliable, quiet horse I ever owned. I now have a serious case of heebie-jeebies, just thinking about it. This happened when I was visiting some family members in Florida. We were having dinner one night when my uncle started telling us silly stories from his youth. He mentioned going to Casa Daga with his friends a couple of times, and immediately the rest of my family started chiming in with their respective Casa Daga stories. Not being a Florida native, I asked them what the hell Casa Daga was. My uncle told me that it was a small town not too far away from where they live. Okay, nothing too interesting about that. When he told me that it had a reputation for being the psychic capital of the world, and that he and his friends would go there in high school because there was a rumor that it was haunted. Being a lover of all things creepy and paranormal, I immediately wanted to go and see what all the fuss was about. My uncle, being up for anything, agreed to take me. Mind you, we had just finished dinner, so this was around 9 p.m. My uncle, myself, and 2 other family members got into his truck and started driving there. After about an hour of driving, we turned onto a narrow gravel road. There were absolutely no lights on this road, and this happened during the summer of 2016, when that whole clown craze was going on. So, when we found ourselves in complete darkness in the middle of nowhere, all I could think of was some freak in a clown costume jumping out to scare us. We passed a lot of houses as we were driving, none of which had any lights on. Granted, it was almost 11 p.m. at this point, but I found it hard to believe that no one had any lights on in their houses. It definitely added to the creepy atmosphere. We finally made it to the hotel without any clown interference, to my delight. It was the only building that had any lights on, and for clarification, we weren't planning on staying at the hotel. My uncle just wanted to show me around and maybe talk to the locals a bit. We parked in the tiny parking lot in front of the entrance and got out of the car. I'm not sure what compelled us to do so, but we all left our respective car doors open. We walked up to the hotel and started looking inside. The lights were on, but there was also no one inside. We found this odd because we were potential customers, and I was expecting someone to come out and greet us. As we were all standing by the entrance, a silver car pulled up to the parking lot. It slowed down in front of us, and suddenly a man stuck out his head. "You're gonna regret this," he yelled, and drove off. Not a word was exchanged between me and my family members. Within a split second, we had booked it back to the car. My uncle started driving us back to the highway so that we could get home. At this point, I'm already freaked out. So when a black SUV with garbage bags taped over the windows starts tailing us, I start praying. It's the middle of the night. There was still no lights on this small road we're driving on, and now some madman was trying to run us off the road. Every time my uncle would speed up in order to avoid getting rear-ended, the guy in the black SUV would speed up too. We were driving at such an incredible speed that it only took us a few minutes to get to the road that connected us to the highway. The SUV was still tailgating us at this point. Halfway down the road, I noticed a familiar car parked on the side of the road by a ditch. It was the silver car from before. The driver was pulling something out the trunk as we were approaching him. Because of the speed at which we were driving, I couldn't see what he was getting out clearly, although I didn't see what was in his trunk. I didn't have a good feeling about it. When we finally got to the end of the road, my uncle was so desperate to get out of there that he ran a red and followed onto the highway. The black SUV didn't follow us on there, and we never really talked about what happened that night, and I basically had forgotten about that trip until today. In 2016, I was camping in my troopy around the Daintree area in Australia. On the night of my 21st, my partner and I decided to go down to the beach, Thornton Beach, and smoke a joint, which I've since realized was probably dumb because of crocodiles. It's a fairly remote beach backing onto rainforest with a few buildings down the southern end. We were sitting up near the tree line in the shadows from the moonlight and having a chat, having a smoke, when we hear the sound of a twig breaking and leaves crunching. We both spin around and look behind us, walking back towards the beach. When we didn't see anything, we assumed it was just an animal or a bird and walked a few meters down the beach to carry on the night. About 5 seconds after sitting down, a man walks out of the rainforest from exactly where we were previously sitting and makes a beeline for the water. We weren't expecting to see another person, so we shuffle back up the beach for safety of the shallows. The man takes off his shirt and just starts to roll around in the shadows of the water. It's pretty strange, but each to their own. He does this for 5 minutes before he gets up, stands in the water, faces the ocean for another 5 minutes, then turns around. He's looking in our direction and takes a few steps forward, bends down and picks up what we assume was a coconut, which causes my partner to stiffen up a bit. He stands there with the coconut staring towards us for quite a while. We were sure he couldn't see us in the shadows, but we're starting to doubt it. I could sense my partner starting to gear up. He felt around for a big stick that was behind him and whispered that if he came close to us, we should run. After maybe 3 to 5 minutes, he drops the coconut, walks back up the beach, and we start to rise, and my partner grabs the stick, but the man walks straight past us and back into the rainforest. We booked it back down to the beach to the car and drove back to our campsite in Dewan, feeling pretty darn rattled. We came to the conclusion that maybe he was on ecstasy, overheated or dehydrated, so that's why he was rolling around in the water. or perhaps just enjoying a nice nighttime ocean dip on his own, crapped himself when he realized we were there, picked up a weapon in case, and then fled. In any case, let's not meet again, strange man. My family is very British. They came to America right at the end of World War I. I never asked why, because from what my mum told me, it hurts for them to talk about. We are so British, in fact, that not only does my grandfather still say God save the Queen, even though having been born in the States, now being from this family who thinks they're from the UK, we carry a lot of stories and legends over. One of these was the story of the Tommyknockers. The Tommyknockers are allegedly the souls of miners or spelunkers who were killed in the caves or mines they worked in, that either collapsed or that they got stuck in. They are said to either try and kill people in the mines or caves by hammering at support beams or integral rocks in the structure to try and cause it to collapse. Some people also believe that the knocking is a warning when a cave or mine is about to collapse in on itself. And now for my story. My grandparents used to own a lot of land. I can't say where, but know that they had a cave that may or may not have been a mine at some point. My cousins and I used to be very mischievous and basically were entertained by disobeying our grandparents. They always told us to stay out of the cave. They said it was very dangerous and that the Tommyknockers might get us. My oldest cousin at the time of 13 said that we should try and take a camera in and find some of the alleged Tommyknockers. They took my grandmother's camera and we ran into the cave when they were asleep, as it was early in the morning. We came to the mouth of the cave and my cousin said that we had to be quiet so that we could hear the knocks. And I know you guys are going to call bull, but he set the damn camera down on the ground and left it there, so we have no proof. We walked into the cave and climbed down into the opening and began walking without saying anything. After about 10 minutes, we began to hear a faint tap, and my cousin told us to shut up and listened. The tapping turned into knocking, which turned into pounding. It seemed like it was right inside the walls of the cave, and we ran out of the cave so fast you wouldn't even believe it. A few days later, after we had gone home, my aunt told me that the cave had collapsed. This happened years ago, when I was maybe 17. I'm 24 now. My family was on vacation and we were staying in a resort in Southern California on the beach. The resort had 2 buildings, one directly by the beach and one was across the street. We were staying in the building across the street. My cousin and sister and myself decided to go sit on the beach one night. It was probably 9 p.m. There were usually a few people out walking or playing around, but on this night there was no one, except for a few couples walking by randomly. We sat down on some towels and watched the water from a good distance. We were chatting and telling stories when we noticed a man walking around us, going to the water, back to the walkway leading up to the resorts, back and forth. He got closer and closer to us until he was so close he stopped on the edge of our towels. He was a big man with shaggy blonde hair. My sister suggested we go down to the water and he followed. At this point we knew he was following us, so we decided to leave. He started up the wooden walkway back to our building, and like I said, our building was across the street. To get to it, you had to pass through a little alleyway. The alley was well lit, and the street was relatively busy, but there was a parking garage adjacent to the alleyway. My head immediately told me not to walk past the parking garage. We were facing the alleyway, about to walk through. This guy is right behind us, and I loudly said, "Hey, wait, let me beat off my sandals." We stopped and took off our shoes and beat the sand out of them. The man passed us reluctantly, so close he was almost touching us. That's when I saw his eyes for the first time. He was definitely on something. His pupils looked messed up. His eyes were as wide as saucers. He passed us slowly and went, where? Directly into the parking garage. I knew he was waiting for us, so we ran. Over the wooden walkway and onto the beach, through the sand to the next walkway, which led up to another building's pool area, and he was behind us again, chasing us, running at full force. We got into the pool area and the man stopped. There was a woman cleaning and we told her what happened, and she got hotel security, and a police officer asked us some questions and walked us back to the building. I was scared by this experience for a while, and will not go to the beach at night again without my very large and tough fiancé by my side, ever. So beach creeper, let's not meet. My friends and I were high in the woods deep in the Sierra Nevadas, in the California backcountry, and decided to travel a few miles off a path to reach a river and shoot at targets with our .22. The path was littered with deer bones and claw marks from bears, so we're freaking out a bit, but finally make it to where we set up camp. I notice off in the distance, about half a mile upstream, the river, and there are two guys walking towards us in the exact direction we are firing our gun. I yell at the guys for them to stop shooting, and we just watch these men wide-eyed in their late 20s and early 30s, walking quickly along the river, when suddenly they both decide to jump in. I should say at this point the river is moving very quickly and could easily sweep you under, and is definitely not safe for a casual swim. We watch as both the men are swept away towards us downstream. One of my friends, Mike, decides to brave it out and get close to the edge and extend a piece of wood for them to grab onto as they're about to pass. Both of the men latch on, and Mike is a hero pulling them to shore. Everyone watches them catch their breath, and we ask the men what they're doing out here, as it's super remote and at least 3 to 4 miles from the nearest trail, and why they both jumped in clearly deadly water. They give us short answers like, "Oh, we're just boys having fun. Just free swimming in the river, you know," while they're leering at us. Immediately the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, and every fibre in my body tells me that they meant us harm. We tell them we're going to head back to the trail, and they say that they'd come with us. Given that we're so far away from civilization and these guys are clearly high on something and dangerous to themselves, we reluctantly agree and allow them to follow us. It was the most quiet hike of my life. I felt them trying to feel out if they could take us in a fight. There were 3 of us and 2 of them. We had a .22 but were young, squirrely adults. I don't know how to explain it, but the hike was us constantly positioning against each other, with body language without ever directly fighting. They would get close to the gun and try to both be near it, and then we would counter by getting between them and the gun as naturally as possible, while hiking up a path that was littered in bear claw marks and dung. We finally made it to the car and they decided we weren't suitable targets and moved on. No idea what 2 random guys were doing risking their lives in freezing cold raging rivers in the Sierra Nevadas, or why they felt they needed to size us up if they could attack 3 random teens, but I'm glad at the end of it, nothing came of it. Working on ships. There was one night I was on a ship sailing through Alaskan waters, and it happened to me my first night ever seeing the Northern Lights. I can't believe how awesome that was. Made the night look like it was dusk, and we were able to see clearly for miles. A few buddies and I hit the roof, or what we call the Lido deck, at 1 AM just to gaze at it. An hour or so in, there were 6 of us on top, nearly the entire crew. A big white spot then shines at us. We were near land, but where the spot was above the water, and it wasn't low enough to be a ship. This was very high up. It shined on us for 15 to 20 seconds, and once the light turned off, we looked to see what it was, but saw nothing. No trace of an aircraft or anything. A few minutes go by and the same light shined on us again. This time it was on the other side of our vessel, above mountains, still unable to see what it was. We all saw it. We have all never seen any aircrafts hovering above these waters, especially at 2 a.m. We don't know what it was. We think it might have been some sort of silenced aircraft the military were probably doing drills on or something. But anyway, that's one of the weirdest things that's ever happened to us in the ocean. This happened to a friend of mine while he was deployed to the Middle East. He's a Marine. The country he was deployed to have a tradition of camping in the desert each winter. He said it would be best to avoid mentioning the name because this happened in December and he prefers to keep it confidential. His unit were invited for a sleepover at the camp by one of the companies they do business with there. They went ahead and had dinner, shared some fun stories around the bonfire, etc. Now it was time to sleep. Apparently the area they were in was rocky and quite pointy, and the only thing between them and the ground was a very thin carpet and their sleep bags. My friend and another guy couldn't sleep, and they didn't want the locals to think that the big bad Marines are a bunch of wusses who can't sleep on the ground, so they didn't complain and just decided to go to the nearest hotel and get back in the morning. The nearest hotel was 45 minutes away, so my friend said he would lie down in the back seat while the other guy drove. Now, while in the car, my friend opens his eyes to see someone was sitting next to the driver. At first, he thought he picked up a hitchhiker because the one in the passenger seat was wearing local clothing and thought, what the hell is this idiot thinking picking up strangers at this hour, and just closed his eyes. After about 10 minutes, he was slammed into the front seat as the car suddenly brakes and the driver flees the car as soon as humanly possible. He gets out to see what happened and sees the other guy freaked out of his mind. Apparently, this someone suddenly appears out of nowhere in the passenger seat while he was driving, was too scared to turn around, but clearly could see them out the corner of his eye, so he just froze and kept driving until he mustered enough courage to slightly turn and get a better look. That's when the entity groaned, which made him freak out and flee. By the time they went to check on the passenger side, there was no one there, and they were certain the door had not been opened. I don't know if the following is related, but they did some asking, and apparently near the area they were camping were some old prisons that were carved into the mountain and used by the British to lock political prisoners, and just left them there until they starved to death. I'm very interested to learn what that was, and if anyone has had some similar stories. On our drill ship that was built in China, we noticed on the drawings there was a room. We went to look at it and couldn't find an entrance, but the spacing was obviously there, and there was an extra room. It might not sound so creepy, unless you've been in these shipyards where two things are known to happen. Stowaways, although I doubt this was the case, but also hundreds of workers at any given time are told to blindly follow orders. You see, when you're building a ship, all projects are almost happening at the same time. It's not always a ground-up situation. People would be welding crane masts while others are under it, welding the floor beneath. There are literally hundreds of people all working on it at the same time. This room had no outer welds whatsoever, which means the welds are from the inside. The theory is that they all welded the different pieces together without realizing they weren't leaving themselves an opening, because they all have different jobs and typically don't collaborate. Because the room is sealed on all 6 sides, to our knowledge, I doubt it was all 6 sides at once. It would have been the last 2 sides and them thinking the other was leaving an opening. I hope that explains it. There's only one possibility that there's an opening between the room and the hull, because it does look sealed at the bottom and top due to the size of the ship. I can't rule out it absolutely went all that way to the hull just from looking at the deck above and below. The double bottom is inspected every so often by a third engineer. It's not a place people go because there's not much of a reason to. I've only been there just to see what it looks like. Never thought about connecting the two. But anyway, we confirmed the room had all 6 sides, yet not a single weld on the outside. There's only one way this could have happened, so I'm sure you're starting to get it now. They must have welded from inside the room and then realized they had no way out upon completion, if the gases didn't kill them first. It's extremely heavy around that room. People say they hear things, and I definitely have. This isn't some old ship either. I rode this ship from China to Amsterdam after completion, and then the maiden voyage to America. I guess hauntings happen quickly. My mum and her friend were out and about late at night, heading to a party. But their car broke down, and being a rural town with a small population, they had to walk about a mile to the nearest house for help. They got to the front door, and of all the people to answer the door, it was one of their high school teachers. He was horrified to see them out late at night alone. He let them use his phone but scolded them, saying it wasn't safe. The location, time, and circumstances. He let them know they were absolute fools and heeded a somewhat vague warning. My mum called my grandfather to come bring gas and or possibly tow their vehicle. When the girls got back to their car, there was a severed cow head on the hood. Blood everywhere. This was near Hermiston, Oregon, apparently well known for devil worshippers. I work on North Sea oil rigs on an ad hoc basis off the coast of Scotland. You sometimes get some unsettling things. Fog can come rolling in out of nowhere, and other rigs you can see off the sides can disappear in front of your eyes. Sometimes you can't see the walkway 6 feet in front of you, or if you're walking over grating you can't see the sea below you, which is about 60 meters down from deck to sea, but you can hear it, all be muffled. The fog can roll in over the course of a few minutes too, so a perfectly clear day can become pea soup. You can also feel the rig moving and swaying on high winds and rough seas. Even though it's a fixed leg platform, it's very unnerving to feel your office swaying when it shouldn't be. My last trip was my first ever night shift, and I found it particularly unsettling, as you've got the background noise of the plant, but I walked around the whole rig without seeing another living soul for my whole shift. Usually there are 130 people on board, although smaller rigs have smaller head counts. Usually once a trip, I'm hit by this awareness that you're very isolated and in the middle of nowhere. Most rigs I've worked on are an hour chopper rides from land, so if something goes wrong, it can escalate very quickly. This took place when I was 12. My dad owned a motorhome and we often went camping. This particular time my dad and I went camping and I took one of my best friends, Violet. For some background on how this place was set up, it was off a main road. There was a road where on one side there was a large campground, and on the other side there was a forest area. In the forest area there was a hiking trail that was about a half-mile long, and in the middle of the trail there was a creek and a large concrete tunnel. On the last night we were going to be staying there, I finally convinced Violet to go walking the hiking trail with me since she refused to go the other times. I asked my dad, and he wouldn't let me go alone. I wanted to go when it got dark because I thought it would be fun. Violet, on the other hand, didn't think it would be fun going in the dark. I just brushed it off and called her a pussy. My dad didn't want us going out if it got too dark, so we waited until dusk. We got some flashlights and headed out. We entered the forest, and I had a headlamp, and Violet had a large flashlight. I was walking in front since the trail was only just big enough for one person at the time, and she was very paranoid and wanted me to go first. We walked until we got to the creek, and there was a large, square-shaped concrete tunnel at the beginning of it. Because I wasn't really afraid of much, I wanted to go inside. I tried to convince Violet to go in with me, but she refused multiple times. "Come on, it's just a tunnel. What's the worst that could happen?" I ask. But she was really paranoid about the whole thing and said, "No way. You can go if you want, but I'm staying out here." I eventually gave up and went in alone. I was about 5'8", and when I got inside the tunnel, I had to crouch down quite a bit to avoid hitting my head. There was water on the floor that ran into the creek, but there wasn't enough to get my shoes wet. There was a lot of graffiti all over the walls. I shot my headlight all over and did the best I could to read it. At this point, I was about 15 feet down the tunnel from the entrance, and while I was distracted, reading all of the stuff on the wall, I didn't pay attention to anything else. But suddenly Violet began yelling at me. She was yelling stuff like, "Get out of there, hurry, let's go." I knew she was paranoid, but I didn't know that she was scared. I was going to go back, but before I did, I took one last look around the tunnel, looked down the far end, and there, at the end, was a 40-year-old man that looked homeless. He was very skinny, his skin almost grey. I looked at him as he was slowly approaching me. I was absolutely scared out my mind. I ran out the tunnel as fast as I could, and because my curiosity always got the best of me, once I got out the tunnel I looked back, and he was just standing at the entrance looking at me. I wasn't sure how he got there so fast, but he did. When I first saw him, he was at least 20 feet down from where I was, and would had to have moved 35 feet down as fast as I had moved 15. And I didn't hear him run, because the water would have made a sound. But seeing him there, 5 feet away from me, was enough to make me run. And I ran faster than I ever have in my life. I was absolutely terrified. I can say with confidence neither me nor Violet slept that night. And to this day, I've never told my dad about what happened. And Violet asked me to never bring it up again. And I still have no idea how he got to me that fast. I really wish I had listened to my friend, and I will never know for sure. But I believe that man had been living in that tunnel for God knows how long. And to this day, I'm still curious to what was at the end.
Growing up, I was always at my grandma's house. My childhood featured a parent with substance abuse issues, and going to my gram's house was the best. I had friends there, and she lived in a really nice suburb with tons of other kids my age. I made really good friends with a neighbor who had woods in his backyard, Mike. We'd often take little lunches packed by my grandma and go into the woods to eat them and admire creeks, birds, and collect pebbles and stuff. You know, kid stuff. This was harmless, and you could usually always see the backs of houses when you went into the woods. I remember one day, we made a pack. Mine was in a grocery bag and planned to venture out further than before. You know how you have limitless energy when you're little, and low back pain hasn't set in from sitting at a desk for most of your adult life. You literally could walk for hours and probably many miles and not even notice, and eat a terribly made PB&J, swig down a can of Coke and be completely rejuvenated. Yeah, that was us. So we walked further than ever. We slid down a hill, and I remember being really scared of this, and hilariously, I'm still majorly scared to fall when hiking. I got a little scuffed up, nothing major, and Mike was slightly older than me, so I wanted to seem tough and just walk it off. We walked deep into the woods, and I remember being just slightly creeped out, but not enough to protest. I wanted to explore too. This is Western Pennsylvania, and I should add, we weren't in the rural areas of my state, but some of the suburbs do intersect with trails and nature preserves that can go on for acres and acres. As we're walking, we come upon a tent in the middle of nowhere. Not a marked camping area, just in the middle of nothing. I remember being terrified. My grandma gave me a lot of freedom because I was a pretty responsible kid, not to mention this was the 90s. Aside from needing to be home by streetlights every night, stranger danger was something she drilled into my head. This set off the internal stranger danger alarm loudly, but at this point I was too afraid to leave Mike's side. So we approached the tent, even though everything inside of me is singing to get the hell out of there. Mike goes up to it. I tentatively follow him. At first I thought someone was just camping, but it looked more permanent than that. There's a fire pit that's still smoking. It appeared to have been doused, and there were bones everywhere, mostly skulls, tiny ones which to my untrained eye looked like animal bones. There were also little pelts of animals covered in what looked like paint and symbols. My adrenaline kicked me right in the arse and I ran. Mike ran too. We ran so far and so fast that we fell down the side of a hill and ended up emerging from the woods on the other side of a shooting range. The men firing were screaming at us to leave, which is understandable, and I also was so scared of the tent that I didn't process the real danger that we were in on a shooting range. We definitely could have died very tragically there. So looking back on this memory, I'm wondering, was this something nefarious? Or could it have been some harmless nomad living in the woods? If they were living there, maybe the bones were from the small game they had to live and eat from, but the pelts with symbols are throwing me. I don't know. This is a weird memory that I can still see clearly to date. What do you all think?
Prior to joining the US Navy, my grandfather took me aside and told me several stories of his time spent in the Navy during World War II. It was his way of ensuring I knew what I was getting myself into. My grandfather was a weapons technician too, WT2, aboard the destroyer USS Maori DD-401 from 1942 to 1945 and manned a .538 caliber cannon. He survived Pearl Harbor, Battle over Tara, Battle of Midway, and the invasion of Luzon, to name a few, with only a small shrapnel wound to his leg in all that time. I'd like to share of these stories because they blow my mind. The date was August 21st, 1943. Location west-southwest of Nendo Island, Solomons. Ship USS Maori, DD-401 destroyer. The Maori was escorting an HMAS Australian vessel to Espiritu Santo, as Japanese forces were still active in the area, and Allied forces were actively attempting to keep Guadalcanal and the Solomons secure after previous weeks of battle with Japanese forces. The night was clear, with every star in the sky. The wind was so low that you could hear gulls fishing off in the distance, and the waves splashing against the hull of the ships. The air felt like Hawaii in spring, and all you wanted to do was bask in the moonlight. When suddenly, voice radio communications from nearby Allied island bases start chirping away with information about visual confirmation of enemy subs in the area to the north. Soon after, on all decks, orders were given and everyone was forced to stand ready. A team was assigned light patrol, and they began panning around looking for subs. Not more than 2 hours go by with no visual contact made, and they're finally given the order to stand down and return to shut-eye duty. Before daybreak, contact from Nendo Island starts coming on voice comms, warning that potentials are flying around in the area 5 miles south of Maury's escort position. Already worried they may have been targeted by Japanese subs from below, they now have to contend with potential aerial assault, and everyone is called to stand ready once more. Engines are killed, emergency lights activated, and orders given to kill all lights. My grandfather, manning his light, is immediately ordered to put that candle out and pushes the searchlight straight down into the water, turning it off. When they finally stopped moving, the crew can hear the low tone humming of several planes passing parallel to their position. Everyone holds their breath and pretends to pretty much not exist, just hoping the enemy does not make visual contact with the ships. So for a good 45 minutes, everyone just sits there until they can no longer make audible contact with their enemy forces they hope would pass. Finally, almost after 2 hours of nothing, they are given the go-ahead to start the engines and return to the passage. My grandfather flicks his cigarette portside and clicks on his searchlight, still pointing into the water. What he says he saw next aged him and the other two with him a good 10 years. Below, where the searchlight sat focused in the water, lay an eyeball the size of a basketball, sitting there staring straight back at him from about 10 feet underneath the water. The next 3 seconds lasted minutes in his mind as he watched this silvery disc of an eye look straight through him. The first of the engines started in what seemed like forever, and the beast that it was broke surface for a brief moment in order to dive deep. Even before people acknowledged the giant squid existed, before they were even caught on camera, my grandfather believed, because he had seen one within 20 feet of his face. In my 8 years of service, I've heard many stories of such things, and even own a few teeth pulled from the rubber lining of the ship. But never have I had any of these experiences myself. Adding that experience in lieu of the drama of war, and you can get a sense for the true terror it would invoke. My grandfather, now 93, is still alive and kicking, even though his dementia is heavy, and he seems to live in the past. It's good to know that there are still some heroes in this world. When I was 20, I used to work as a pizza delivery guy in a small city in northern Germany. On my way home, I had to drive a few miles on a remote state road that led through forests and farmland. One night at around 1 a.m., there was a huge thunderstorm, so I had to drive slowly and carefully. When I arrived at the junction, I noticed a figure standing in the middle of the road. It looked like a tall and slender man in a long black leather cloak with a hood. At first, I thought it was someone who had an accident and was looking for help, but when my headlights hit the figure, I noticed that the cloak, especially the hood, appeared to be empty. My headlights did not illuminate the cloak like they should have. It was just the lighting reflecting on the smooth, wet surface that allowed me to see the shape. Of course, I floored the gas pedal and went as fast as I could. A few miles later, I ran into the same, or at least a very similar figure again, standing in the middle of the road, unmoving. This time I didn't even slow down and rush past it. It nearly scared me to death. A few weeks later, this time without a thunderstorm, but a beautiful warm summer's night, I encountered another creature right where I saw the black figure previous. It looked like a giant deer, but without fur and pale grey/white skin. It was extremely skinny, nearly skeletal, and had an abnormally long and thin tail. It ran alongside the road and kept pace with me quite easily as I drove by it. Only when I slammed on the gas pedal and went suicidally fast did it start to fall behind and eventually disappeared into a crop field. The very next day I quit my job and have never used that road again at night. For a couple of months last year, I lived in South Africa and did marine research with some of the people who made Shark Week. The work involved sailing out each morning, attracting sharks to the research vessel, about 21 feet with 2 engines, and then collecting data about them by various means. Going into this project, I had very little knowledge of marine biology, and as a result, I was usually relegated to the role of chummer. This lucky individual has the role of grinding up large quantities of rotting sardine heads and continuously pouring them off the side of the boat to attract white sharks. My experience took place on my first time chumming. It was a beautiful summer morning, and we had just set out to one of the primary research locations, a reef colloquially known as Shark City by the locals. The seas were unusually rough, and we were watching quite large waves hit the beach, about a third of a mile from where we had laid anchor. The process of grinding up the rotting fish involves the chum dance, standing in a rectangular container in a pair of rain boots. I was crushing the fishy remnants while dancing to Michael Jackson's Thriller, a favorite amongst the researchers. Just as the chum dance reached its finale, and a fair amount of rotting sardine was in the water, the crow's nest spotter hastily pointed to a white glimmer just a few feet to our starboard. We had gotten lucky. A 15-foot female great white had come to investigate the fishy carnage. Contrary to popular beliefs, white sharks don't circle boats near the surface with their fin above water. They are indeed ambush hunters, swimming in sporadic patterns around prey, diving to depths below sight, and then eventually striking in a rush from below. We researchers, me in particular, considering I had never seen a shark before, were giddy, as this large female made a few loops around the vessel before disappearing into the iron-green abyss. About a minute later, as I was peering off the side, still standing in the chub container, I noticed that the jovial South African laughter behind me had abruptly stopped. I turned around to see a large wave, 10 to 15 feet, coming in quickly on our starboard side. In the few seconds before adrenaline set in, I remember seeing the wall of water crashing over me, spinning and floating. I had been flung overboard by the freak wave. Dear friends, at this point in this story you must consider who I was at the time. A jet-lagged, somewhat nerdy, skinny American teenage boy, outside of the US for the first time. There I was, floating in the South African Sea, a few thousand miles from home, in a cloud of rotting sardine matter. Oh yes, the chum container had been flung off the boat with me, with a 15-foot great white shark swimming probably a few yards below. I have very little memory of what happened next. My mind clouded by adrenaline. My salvation came in the form of a large arm that pulled me back aboard the boat, which luckily had not capsized. Oh, what joyous breath of salty ocean air I breathed then. I'll just say a few more words. I cannot think of a good thing that came out of this sharky episode. For one, it accelerated me getting to know the researchers who, presumably at the result of our mutual peril, welcomed me in with open arms for the rest of my time in Africa. The large shark, which is seen regularly to this day in Shark City, was named after me. This experience gives me the opportunity to share my obligatory PSAs to everyone I tell. Sharks are incredible creatures. They should be respected, admired, and protected. I'm not even going to tell you that they should be feared, as they definitely should to a healthy extent. However, when you consider how many people are killed each year in shark attacks versus how many sharks are slaughtered for sport, trophies, or fins, you realize that we are indeed a far greater threat to them than they are to us. You may have heard it all before, but I think it's still worthy to say. I worked in a salt mine under Lake Erie a few years ago, and generally speaking, when things are brought down, they're never brought back up. It takes a lot of time to disassemble everything up top, secure and cover the parts, and put it back together down below, and vice versa. So there's tons of old trucks, tractors, and countless other things lined up on the far side of the mine. In the 80s, The University of Michigan and Cal Irvine were studying proton decay and trying to capture measurements when it actually happened. Conducting this experiment topside is problematic because of cosmic rays and other forms of interference, so the mine was chosen as 2,000 feet down the Earth absorbs pretty much anything. So they dug out a pool about 80 by 70, filled it with 2.64 million gallons of purified water, and put fancy cameras and other equipment along the side. They had a whole shop, lab, and drive center down there. And eventually the grant money ran out after a few years, so the mine threw up some caution tape on the main steel door leading to the study, and that was that. Fast forward 20 years and I'm working there as an electrician, and I get a job to fix some big conveyor motor drive. So I set off to try and cannibalize some parts off old equipment. I remember one of the old-timers telling me there's a bunch of abandoned equipment in an area by the Kepi lift, which is the main elevator. I get over there and find a big steel door hanging off its hinges, with some very old caution tape lying on the ground. The whole study had to be accessed through this one door, which was dug into the wall. So after a while, the earth slowly crushes, bends, and pushes the ground up. After several tries, I yank the door open and step inside only to crap myself when I see a full scuba outfit, wetsuit, mask, belt, gloves, hanging 3 feet inside. So I collect myself, somehow find I didn't actually defecate my pants, but how I'll never know, and go inside, past the goddamn scuba dude. Everything inside was left exactly how it was 20 years ago. Coffee cups left out, day planners, job schedules, along with tons of scuba gear, oxygen-filled tanks and computers. I make it about 10 feet-ish to the edge of the pool, and it's hard to see if the water's still in it, because there's no wind to move it. But eventually I see there's 60 plus feet of pure water in an absolutely dark pool. The sight of a huge black pool in a huge black hole in the ground, lit only by the small amount of light my camp light put out, and the absolute silence of being underground made me feel really uncomfortable. So I left in a hurry. That place really creeped me out. I was working on a car carrier 4 years ago in the Middle East. Our typical route went through private waters at the time, and so we always picked up 4 ex-Marines as security in Aqaba, Jordan, before we went. One night while we were going through pirate waters off Yemen, we started to have problems with the main engine, so we stopped and had to drift for a bit to figure out what the problem was. During this time I was working on the stern, back end of the vessel. I couldn't really see anything out in the ocean. Everything was dimly lit on the ship. I don't know why, but I got bored and turned on the spotlight. And there he was. This guy with a gun in a rusted little boat, staring at me about 15 feet from the ship. I just stared back at him, kind of stunned. I was afraid if I reached for the radio to call one of the Marines, he'd shoot me. The Marines were the ones with the weapons. So he looked at me, and I looked at him, and he sort of gave me a nod, as if he was telling me, "Well played," and then I gave him one back. Then he slowly rowed his boat back off into the deep, pitch-black night. I don't know how many others there were, but I did call it in on the radio as soon as I lost sight of him. I still remember his face today, the deep, stern, concentrated look on his face. It was 2001. My friend and I, 17, both female, are driving back from a late movie to my house one night. I lived in a pretty rural area in Maine, about 20 minutes from the nearest town. As we were driving down the highway through the woods, we passed a median with a car sitting in it, facing in the oncoming direction, with all its lights off. Right after we drove past it, it flashed its lights, did a 3-point turn, and started driving behind us. We giggled that, "Oh, it must be a gang initiation and we're gonna get murdered," because this was Maine, and that was obviously not gonna happen.
The turnoff on my road was a few miles away, and this car stayed behind us the whole time. We made the left turn and the car kept going down the highway. But 30 seconds later we realized the car must have been backed up on the highway and made the turn after us. Now we were getting a little worried. There was still one more road to turn down before we got to my house, as this was way in the woods. And the car did the same thing, backed up and made the left after us. Now we were legit freaked. I had a long driveway and the car followed us right up to the driveway and almost up to my house, which had all the lights on because my mum was home. We ran into the house just in time to see the mystery car reverse back down the driveway and drive away. To this day we still have no idea why that car was following us, if they thought we were someone else, or if they actually had bad intentions and only changed their mind when they saw that my house lights were on, since we only ever saw the front of the car and never caught a license plate or a better description than just the blue car.
For context, we're female. This happened back mid-February of 2020, and my friends and I were all 15. This takes place in Italy, on a school trip we were on. The trip itself was alright, but seeing as we were dumb teenagers, we decided to push boundaries. Our school had booked us into a pretty average hotel, low budget, so one night 2 of my friends asked me if I wanted to sneak out with them during the night so that we could go to the nearby beach. I'm generally quite sensible, but they kept persuading me, until I finally gave in. We would only get one opportunity to do this, right? So we waited until about 1 a.m., messaging each other when to leave the room, and meet in the corridor. It was only 3 of us. We didn't want anyone else to know as they might snitch. Looking back on it now, this was probably a reckless decision, considering the events that would unfold in the next hours to come, and how that night could have ended. The teachers were sleeping in the room opposite to ours, so we had to be so quiet as to not get caught. I can still remember how worried I was that we would be caught, and they would ring my parents. If you couldn't tell already, I'm genuinely quite anxious, so I avoid rule breaking most of the time. This night was an obvious exception. We were successful though, and managed to sneak our way down to the lobby. For whatever reason, the front desk attendant wasn't there, so we'd hurry through the doors not wanting to get caught out. None of us actually knew any Italian, so this was possibly one of the dumbest things we could have done. We walked for about 2 miles down to the beach, all smug that we had actually managed to pull off the perfectly devised plan. The streets were empty. Not surprising considering it was 1 a.m., but it didn't stop that anxious feeling in the back of my mind. I knew that what we were doing would get us into so much trouble if caught. We had to walk down hundreds of steps in order to actually get to the beach. Plenty of time to reconsider our actions, but we were stupid and determined to keep going. Something I regret now. The beach was really quite beautiful. It was a full moon at night, and the beach was lit up in a beautiful soft light. We had the place to ourselves. We pissed around for about 10 minutes or so, and then my friends said they wanted to go into the sea. I was adamant that I wasn't, despite their protests, so they told me to keep an eye on their belongings. We had only really brought our jackets and phones. They rolled up their trousers and went knee-deep into the sea. I started filming them and taking pictures. The others would be so jealous. I remember thinking that. Just wait until they see the pictures. They spent about 5 minutes frolicking in the cold sea before they came back to the beach and started stripping off more. I couldn't believe it. They were going to go swimming. They had the genius idea to go in their underwear. I couldn't stop laughing at this point. Looking back at it now, I should have persuaded them not to, but I didn't understand the gravity of the situation we would soon be in. They both ran towards the waves and jumped in at the same time, screaming and giggling in the freezing water. I stood on the shore laughing and filming the whole thing. While guarding their things, I got the eerie feeling of being watched. I can only put it down to instinct. Naturally, I put my guard up and looked around. I'm so glad I did. because God knows what would have happened if I hadn't have noticed them. 2 men were sitting about 30 meters from us in the dark. I can't be sure, as I only noticed them for a brief moment before turning back around, but it looked like one of the men was holding up his phone filming us. My stomach dropped. I called both my friends. They must have noticed the tone in my voice. I was shaken, despite my best efforts to be discreet. They walked up to the sand towards me, dripping wet and freezing cold. I told them 2 men were sitting behind us watching. I'd never seen them so scared. That's when the trepidation hit us. No one knew we were here. As far as everyone else knew, we were fast asleep in our hotel rooms. These men could easily take us down, abduct us, end our lives. Something worse, perhaps. And no one would ever know. I whispered to my friend that we needed to leave. I told them to not bother getting dressed, to just grab their stuff and leave as inconspicuously as possible. They agreed with no hesitation. At this point, I was really worried. The men must have known that we saw them despite our best efforts. Nothing could conceal the raw fear we felt, and it showed on our faces. As we approached the steps, I made a quick glance behind her, and a sweat broke out on my forehead. The men were now slowly walking towards us. Fight or flight kicked in, and I shouted to my friends to run. Barefoot and soaked, they scrambled up the steps as quickly as they could, and we kept pushing. I didn't look behind me for fear of how close they could be. We didn't stop once we reached the stops or the steps onto the pavement. We kept running on pure adrenaline. Our legs burned. I looked down to see both of my friends' feet were bloody, but they didn't stop. I kept glancing behind us once we were on a stretch of pavement, but I didn't see the men, and I didn't know if they were still following us or not. That did nothing to ease my nerves, as we didn't stop running until the hotel was in sight. I turned around, and to my relief, I could not see the men. We walked through the entrance to the hotel. This time, however, there was a man at the front desk and started speaking to us in Italian. We didn't understand him, so we kept walking, my friends leaving bloody footprints through the lobby. Once we reached the corridor, we made a mutual vow to never tell anyone about that night, and we all went back to our rooms. The man at the front desk must have told our teachers that he saw us walking at 3 a.m. through his hotel lobby, leaving bloody footprints everywhere, because that morning I awoke to a loud banging on our door. Mrs. Smith was shouting at everyone, asking who it was that left last night. Of course, everyone was confused, and I didn't dare speak up. Neither did my friends. After several speeches made about the severity of our actions and how we were going to find out who it was, I was terrified. My 2 friends finally spoke up and admitted it was them. Thankfully, they left my name out of it, which I'll forever be grateful for. The teachers were furious, and as you can imagine, both my friends received phone calls home, and they had to delete all pictures taken that night. The teachers wanted all evidence deleted, as it reflected badly on them because in their care, we did something so reckless. They were just concerned about not losing their jobs. My friends didn't argue, because they were still protecting my name and all, and didn't want the teachers actually asking for the photos, so they just obliged. I always think back on how that night could have ended, how horribly wrong it could have gone, and despite being one of the dumbest things I've ever done, I'm glad I decided to go, because it terrifies me to think what would have happened to my 2 friends if I wasn't there to spot those men.
This happened over a year ago. I'm a 53-year-old female, and am from the US, but now live in the UK. I thought this kind of thing only happened in Florida, where my family still lives, and I've had my fair share of creepy encounters there. But I like to think I'm a tough old bird who doesn't mind helping out a fellow human being. I was driving home with my dogs from my partner's house, as we were still dating at the time, and I had to work the next day and needed my work stuff. He lived an hour away, so it was a long drive home through the rustic English countryside. It was late-ish, but was still light, as summer lingered about on those lovely long sunsets. As I'm driving, I get a call from my son who was living in the US. I just wanted to pull over and touch base with my son to let him know that I was driving and would catch up with him when I got home. I pulled over at the next convenient stop, which happened to be a drive on someone's farm. I wasn't aware of this until after getting out of my car later. I had vaguely noticed a big barn next to the farmhouse, kind of unkept, with no lights on. It's still light out, so nothing overtly odd, I suppose, about no lights on inside the house behind the guy. While I'm talking to my son, both my dogs start to grumble about something. I look up and see a very big, tall, mid-60s to 70s older man waving at me for help. He had the hood/bonnet of his truck propped open and was sitting on a stool next to it. Since I had a mobile phone, I thought that I would offer to call someone to help him. As soon as I stepped out my car, he shouted at me to roll up my window because of my dogs. My babies are about the size of a beagle, and my girl is fiercely protective, so I roll only about halfway up, enough so they can still poke their heads out, but not down far enough so it's an easy jump from the car. Some people are just scared of dogs, right? Even though most farms have working dogs, but okay. As I get to his truck, I offer the phone. He's old, maybe he doesn't have a cell phone, you know. He says no to the phone call, and says he just needs someone to help fill the radiator because his car is overheated. So me being no stranger to a little light auto maintenance, I look over to see the radiator cap already off. He offered me a full bottle of water to which to perform this top-up. Mind you, the truck was stone cold. As I got to the radiator, it was already full of water. Pesky alarm bells going off in my head even louder now. At this point, I should have just told him to call the AA, a car recovery service, or alternatively the police. He said no thank you again, and began to thank me profusely for helping with his truck. He stood up and asked for my address so that he could drop off some sausages, because you see, he was a butcher. Alarm bells are just screaming in my head now. All the while my dogs are not loudly barking, but you can hear them nervously woofing from my car in the background some 20 feet away. Luckily, he seemed disabled since he was wearing a knee brace and also had a walking stick. I only got close to him once to get the water bottle handoff. I stayed at arm's length and made my excuse to immediately walk back to my car. I've never gotten out of somewhere so fast in my life. After recounting this story to my daughter, she said it was a good thing that the dogs were with me, and that they probably saved me from getting into further trouble. I seriously thought I had just met Leatherface's granddad. Definitely felt like a setup. Who sits outside in the semi-dark like that in the middle of nowhere, waiting for some chance help? You don't really need to wander by. Super scary creepy. Last October, I was in California for 11 days after my brother's wedding in San Diego. I just wanted to drive around the state and visit California places that had captured my imagination over the years, and I love driving almost as much as I love cars. Some destinations, the Pacific Coast Highway, San Francisco, Bodega Bay, where part of Hitchcock's The Birds was filmed. This movie scared the hell out of my now deceased mother. I also wanted to visit Clipper Mills, where the longest audio of Bigfoot was captured one night in 2012. I don't necessarily believe in Sasquatch, but would never discount someone else's experience, especially if I wasn't there, so off I went. Clipper Mills is in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, about 70 miles northeast of Sacramento, very near the dam that was in danger of falling last year, and quite remote. After Bodega Bay, I head across the state for my destination, arriving near Sacramento in time for a late dinner. So it's after dark when I set out on the final leg. Very dark. It takes me a good while on all the twisty, turning roads to find my way there.
I wanted to get to this exact spot the person who posted the video parked that night. He never specified where exactly within the video, but I managed to do some digging in the YouTube comments section and related videos, and more or less found the spot he was actually at. Around 11 PM, I pulled my rented Camry well off the dark 2-lane road to avoid any issues with the very sparse traffic. I saw none whatsoever, as I sat in the darkened interior, listening and allowing my eyes to adapt to the dark for about 20 minutes. I heard nothing but assorted insects, and I sat there, saw nothing moving at all. Eventually, not wanting to activate my car's interior lighting, I crawled out the driver's side window into the black night. I army crawled with my cell phone, with no service, and my handheld GPS to find my way back should I get lost in the dark, and the red flashlight I use with my telescope. I stand there, right by the car window for a solid 2 minutes before I screw up the courage to move away from the Camry. Eventually I walk up the road, still not hearing anything but bugs. Suddenly, without conscious decision to do so, I veer right and head up into the woods. My feet are crunching pine needles now, and to my mind I sound like Bigfoot stomping around myself. After what was about 20 minutes, I stopped to listen, and added to the insects I hear this faint screeching sound far off in the blackness that doesn't sound like an insect at all. It has more consciousness. Now, the thorough darkness adapted my mind, and I hear whispering. It sounds like a person in distress or perhaps a large primate. I remain still. I hear something small scurrying around in the underbrush, followed, a minute later, by that same forlorn sound, now closer. It's time to return to the car. As I'm walking back to the car, I hear this spooky sound every 20 to 30 seconds, and now it's coming from behind me and in front of me. It seems to have a vocabulary of some sort. Different vocalizations, some guttural, some high-pitched, and everywhere in between. My mind is having fun just messing with me now. I was never so happy to see a Camry in all my life. I started it up before my arse was in the seat, and I think I half expected to see scores of red eyes glowering at me in the headlights from the dark forest. But I didn't. Now spooked and my mind telling me some homicidal axe-wielding lunatic was nipping out of my heels, I went back the way I came at a much quicker pace of the road and in the woods on the other. I barely missed crushing it. It scared the hell out of me right there. I slowed down a bit, the thought of nearly mowing down an innocent mutt overcoming my mind. The same hour down the road towards Sacramento, when I noticed I had cell service again, I opened my Expedia app and found a hotel nearby for the night. Once safely ensconced in said hotel room, I began scouring the internet on my iPad and came to the conclusion that what I heard was a barred owl or western screech owl, but I could never be 100% sure. It was very creepy though, and I'm done with wandering alone in the woods at night, I think. My grandpa got lost in Mammoth Cave after he got back from World War II. Apparently before he was drafted it was not a national park, and the rules around exploring it were very loose. The property it was on was privately owned, and locals were known to trespass and explore the cave, or that's what my grandpa used to tell me. He and his friends very well may have been the only people trespassing. While my grandpa was serving in the Pacific Theater, the cave became a national park. After arriving home, my grandpa and his friends that survived the war went back to explore for old time's sake. They were wandering around with a flashlight when they heard a tour group. Considering that they weren't in there legally and had bypassed many federal trespassing signs, they cut the lights and slowly but surely tried to walk unnoticed back to the entrance. Unfortunately, they went deeper and spent 17 hours in there before getting out. He didn't have many stories because apparently you inch along in complete darkness without being able to see your hand in front of your face. But he said one of his friends kept saying, "We didn't survive that crap to die in here." When I was about 6, my family went on vacation to the beach in Florida. I'm a lot younger than my siblings, so while they were doing their own thing with their friends, I was stuck wherever my mum would take me. For the most part, we stayed in the extremely crowded pool area by a hotel, which had direct access to the beach. It's all a bit hazy, but at some point when I was swimming, I looked up to where my mum was supposed to be sitting, and she wasn't there. I was really attached to her, so I got out and started looking for her. I scanned all the chairs, took a trip around the bar next to the pool, but I couldn't find her. For some reason, 6-year-old me decided she'd gone for a walk on the beach without me, so I made my way out there looking for her. I walked about half a mile down the beach, out onto the crowds to a more vacant area, and just remembered that I started to cry, because I thought I'd never see my mum again. Just as I had basically given up, a woman and a man came up to me. They asked me who I was, if I had any family nearby, and I had told them I was alone and looking for my mother. They said to me that they had seen my mother and told me that they would hang out with me until she returned. Well, these people took me about 2 miles away from my hotel. We walked down the beach to a more residential area, and they kept insisting my mom was going to be down on the other end of the beach, and that they were going to take care of me. They tried to get me to build sandcastles with them, play in the water, and even told me that we could leave to go get dinner, and they'd bring me back after. I kept telling them no. I wanted to return to my hotel, so that I could go up to my room and check for my mum there. And that's when they got really upset with me. The woman said, "We're going to leave to get dinner at our house, and we'll bring you back to your hotel afterwards, got it?" I was starting to get really nervous, so I told them I didn't want to go with them, and that I could walk back to the hotel on my own. The man then said, and I'll never forget this, "You're coming home with us for dinner." He said it in one of these creepy do-or-die tones. I don't know, it just stuck with me. Lucky for me, I heard my name in the distance. There was a group of people yelling for me, so I bolted over to them and they asked me who I was. I told them my name and they smiled so big and said, "There are lots of people looking for you." When I turned around to tell the group that a man and woman had been hanging out with me, they were gone. The group, which actually ended up being hotel workers, took me back to the hotel where everyone was waiting. There was a fire truck, an ambulance, and a news crew, because I had been gone for over half the day. The entire pool area had been shut down in efforts to arrange search parties. My mother was sobbing, but all was okay. When I told the hotel workers what happened, they were extremely concerned. Apparently not even a week before, a child went missing in their beach access area. When the kid was found, he claimed a man and woman lured him out to their car, where they tried to forcibly take him home with them. And that's when he bolted away and found another family for help. I was almost next. In 2014, I was driving at night on Highway 81 in Oklahoma. It was around 2 a.m. and I hadn't seen another car for at least 30 minutes. It was on a stretch of road between Chickasha and Rush Springs. In other words, the middle of nowhere. I come over a small rise and see a car upside down in the ditch, and a body just laying out of the car. Kind of looked like he was sleeping on his side. I slam on the brakes, get out of the car and run over to the guy. I touch his shoulder, and he kind of slumped over on his back. It was then I could see his head was smashed flat on the left side and his abdomen was open. I could smell whiskey coming out of his gut. It was horrifying. This man had no pulse. So I get my phone out and call 911. I give them an estimate of where I am, and they tell me the nearest help is 25 minutes away, and that I needed to wait with the wreck until they arrive. Hell no. I hang up the phone and look around. I am alone, in Oklahoma, in the middle of nowhere. My only companion a dead man. Not knowing what to really do, I took his hand and said the Lord's Prayer, then covered his face with a shirt just hanging out of the car. I was seriously shaking a bit. It was then I heard coyotes turning up. If you haven't heard this sound, it's akin to small children being badly hurt. They wail and screech in what I think is a big circle around me and this man. It's been 15 minutes and no cars have shown up. I hear them on the highway. They are crossing out just out of the headlights of my car. Now I have a decision. Do I get in my car and let them come up and tear this guy to pieces, or do I find something to swing and protect his body? I chose the latter. I got the tire iron out of my trunk and got out over to where he's laying. I guess I'm making a stand. I wait another 5 or so minutes and hear them running around in the dark. I realize I'm not truly in control of the situation, and something very primal comes over my brain. It's akin to rage along with a heavy dose of fear. Whatever was going to happen, I was going to fight like a crazed ape in the savannah. At that moment, I see car lights. Finally, a car shows up, and wouldn't you know it, it's a Pontiac Grand AM, full of methed up country boys. They pull over and look at me, and see the dead man, then the car. I say, "Guys, that guy is dead, and there are coyotes circling me." They go into their car, pull out several handguns and a few flashlights. They are wired as hell and excited to kill these coyotes, although they are almost as unnerved as the wild animals out in the dark. A few minutes pass and we hear a siren off in the distance. The guys say, "It's the cops!" They jump in their car and haul ass. I'm alone again. Me and this poor man. 60 seconds later, a state trooper shows up, and then 2 deputy sheriffs and finally 3 city cops from some small town called Ninica, and finally an ambulance. They look at the guy and pronounce him dead, and ask me at least 100 questions, finally asking if they could search my car for drugs. I'm sober for the last 7 years. They search, find nothing, and say thank you for staying with the wreck and that I can leave. I left and start driving down this pitch-dark road yet again. I feel like I've been in a battle for my life, and thinking our civilized behavior is little more than a thin veneer over a wild animal that wants to survive. This happened on a trip sanctioned by my former high school. We went to Russia and had a wonderful time in Moscow and St. Petersburg. The travel agency, in a bid to get more money, offered us an extension to Tallinn, Estonia, and Helsinki, Finland. Being school kids out of the United States, some of us for the first time, of course we took it. We took an uneventful trip on a bus to Estonia and then a ship to cross the Baltic Sea into Finland. The trip leader decided we had been pretty damn responsible for the past week and a half and told us we could sit and eat wherever we wanted and told us where to find him. We had lunch on the ship, and that's when things turned creepy. A group of girls had claimed a table to themselves, and they were just chatting and eating. Then a man came up and spoke to them, in Russian. They apologized and said they could only speak English, and he left. Then he came back a few minutes later and sat at the table right next to them. After a few minutes of having him stare at them, they moved to a different table in a different part of the ship. A few minutes later, the same man appeared and sat right next to them again. Then one of them saw him take out a camera and snap a few pics of them. Having enough of this, the group set off to find a parent or teacher. They hit the jackpot, and most of the teachers and a few parents were sitting together, and they told them what was happening. The trip leader went off to find some employee on the ship to help us out, and the rest all came to the table of girls. Once the adults came crowding in, the man left. The girls all felt better, but stuck with the adults just to be safe. Then one girl, Mary, went to the bathroom. She knew another person was already in them, and she felt safe enough to go on her own. Then, on her way, she saw the same creepy man from before. She hurried past, outside the ladies' room, and turned back. He was waiting for her at the end of the hall. She went into the bathroom and began hyperventilating. What she didn't know was that one of the dads followed her just to be on the safe side, and he saw her being followed. He brushed right past the creepy man and stood guard at the bathroom door, being sure to give the man a proper glare. and he walked off in a hurry. Once he was gone, he knocked on the bathroom door and told her that he would wait for her, and it was safe to come out. The trip leader found someone who spoke English and told them what had happened, and they said that they would keep a lookout for the man and make sure he was stopped if he was caught leaving the ship. The story happened in the summer of '09. I spoke to the parent who stood guard in the bathroom a few years later, and he said he remembered the man was short, had a beard, and he ran off when the parents waved at a security camera and then pointed at him, if you wanted more context. But no one saw him again after that, so I assumed that he was caught somewhere, or else he snuck off with his pictures of underage girls. Creepy pervert.
This encounter happened about 3 weeks ago, right around the time lockdown was in its prime here in Australia. I'm a 23-year-old female living near Byron Bay, about a 20-minute drive away in the surrounding hinterlands. I was born and raised in the city though, so I like to think my judgment of character is a bit finer developed than country folk. For those not familiar, Byron is a major tourist attraction in northern New South Wales, really close to the Queensland border. It's a beachside town known for its laid-back lifestyle. Because of this, we get a lot of passers-by, even a little bit further out because of the nice views and rich bushland. And it's not unusual to meet a few odd people here and there. There's also your dose of strange activity, i.e. backpacker Theo Hayes' disappearance not long ago. If you're interested in learning more about the case, The Lighthouse is a great podcast about it. Lots of people up here have their theories on it, ranging from cults to just straight up cold-blooded murder. In my suburb, it's still quite rural. On our street, there are about 5 houses total, covering a good couple of 100 acres. And at the end of the street, there's a path through the bush to a lovely waterfall. The journey from my property to the beginning of the track is about 5 minutes, and the path leads to 2 destinations. The first destination is about 5 minutes into the track at the top of the waterfall. It has a little wooden platform you can stand on to look out whenever the waterfall and stream lead into it. The second is about another 5 minutes down the track, which is the waterfall itself. Most people keep to the left of the waterfall and will sit under it in the cave, as the almost non-existent clearing to the right of it is quite inconvenient and tricky to get to if you aren't planning on getting really wet. This is important later. I used to go down there quite often to write in my journal and to clear my head, and my favourite place is just to the top of the waterfall. I'd climb through the fence next to the wooden platform and sit next to the stream on the rocky face that covers either side of the stream. The view was nicest there, and I also liked to sit facing the wooden platform so I could keep better tabs on my environment. This particular day, I went down and coming up to the track, I noticed a camper van parked with lots of tools and rope attached to the roof. I couldn't see anyone in there, but just had a bit of an inkling there was. So I gave the car a pretty wide berth, social distancing, but also my ever-present paranoia thanks to this and other true crime subs. As I passed, I noticed the side door was open, which quickly slid shut. Straight up, I thought it was pretty weird. It's illegal to set up camp there, and also we were in a period of essential travel only, so I wasn't really expecting to see anyone down there except for a neighbor going for a stroll. However, I passed it off as a triade, wanting to get out of the house into nature for a bit after work or something, and kept going on. I went to my usual writing place, but as we'd had a bout of pretty heavy rain in the few days prior, the stream was full, and I wasn't up to crossing it. So I sat on the same side as the wooden platform about 10 to 15 meters away. I wasn't there for long, maybe 5 minutes of writing with my headphones in when I heard something. It sounded like a bird over my music, so I went back to what I was doing. But then a few seconds later, I saw someone out the corner of my eye coming onto the platform. I ignored them and tried to go back to what I was doing, partly because I was in a pretty foul mood and wanted to be left alone, but also because it's not really common for anyone to talk to each other out in the bush, apart from the occasional, "How you doing?" passing someone on the back track. So I thought maybe they were on the phone. But no. He yelled out to me again, which I ignored, and then again I got the feeling he wasn't gonna let up. So I feigned surprise along the lines of, "Oh, sorry, I didn't see you and couldn't hear you over my music." He was in his late 30s to early 40s, a pretty ordinary looking dude. The rest of the conversation is hard to recall verbatim, but essentially it went like this. "Are you gonna jump off the waterfall?" "No." "Why not?" "Because I don't know how deep the water is." Good answer. It seemed pretty harmless, and I assumed he was just visiting the falls for the first time, so I tried to cut off the conversation by going back to my writing. He didn't let up, however, and this is where it started to get a bit weird. I was already feeling quite unsettled by his presence, as he wasn't very focused on the surroundings, and more on me, which is pretty strange considering the entire world is in a state of encouraging no communication. "What, are you one of those nature people who likes to come out here by yourself?" "No." "What are you doing out here then?" "I'm just trying to clear my head and write. It's nice out here." "Am I bothering you?" "Yeah, but whatever." Honorable mention to my ADHD for making me always susceptible to saying the wrong thing and pretty much incapable of lying. There was a bit of a lull here, both of us just kind of sizing each other up. Me just really wanting him to get lost, but also not being too worried if he did try anything, as I had a large stick with me, and it was still pretty warm out, so I always carry it because of snakes. "How did you get here?" "Oh, I just climbed down off the path and through the fence." "No, I mean, how did you get here to this place?" I walked?" "Pretty long walk to be out here by yourself." "Not really. I live just up the road." Something about this response changed something in his behavior. But, as we were pretty far apart, it was a bit hard to figure out what. Regardless, I wasn't vibing the situation at all, and was also kicking myself for making it glaringly obvious to some random dude I was out here alone, and for not having told my family where I was going. Guess I'll leave you to your writing. This calmed me a lot, and once again, just passed him off as a passerby. The view's a lot nicer under the waterfall if you follow the path. "Oh, I don't know if I could go alone. There could be some people down there waiting to mug me. You'd have to come with me." Like what? Who says this? Especially to someone you've just met in the middle of nowhere. No, probably just someone having a picnic or a swim. He stood there for a bit longer than I would have liked, staring at me, and then finally left me alone with an, "Alright, see you later," as he headed back up the path towards the parking lot, and I assumed he was going home. I still felt a bit uneasy, so I turned off my music completely and tried to go back to my writing. Some time passed, but I was struggling to concentrate, which isn't unusual. But it wasn't my usual restlessness. I just felt so uncomfortable, almost exposed, so I took a break to just enjoy the scenery and look down at the bottom of the waterfall. And this guy is standing to the right of it, really inconvenient to get to, and also was the only place from down there where you could see me. That's exactly what he was doing, just standing there staring at me. I thought I was just wigging out, but nope, I could literally feel his eyes on me. I noped out of there. Even if he was just a creepy dude with innocent enough intentions, I wasn't going to wait around and find out. I'd have a 5-minute head start if he did try to follow me. So I ran back home, and what was left of my journal entry for the day was essentially just about this weird guy. I waited to hear his car go by as well, but it didn't. only one road, so I would have heard him leaving, which I thought was strange. So I assumed he must have set up camp there or whatever, or just left later in the night. Either way, I was sufficiently creeped out, and it ruined that spot for me. I haven't been back since.
I circumnavigated the globe from the ages of 23 to 25 on a 43-foot sailboat. One of the freakiest incidents we had on board was when we were leaving Singapore in the middle of the night. Aside from the constant game of Frogger, dodging freighters, our path was straightforward. About 3 a.m., I was alone at the helm, with everyone else asleep below. Suddenly I hear a beep from the radar, which we had set to warn about anything within a quarter mile of our vessel. Looking round, I couldn't find anything obvious within that range, so I put the boat on autopilot and went down to investigate. Typically, other ships show up as little blobs, but for some reason the radar was registering a long, solid line, the length of the screen directly in front of us, and it was getting closer fast. Heart racing, I went back on deck to see what could possibly be registering such a bizarre signature. Eyes slowly adjusting. I looked into the dark, peering as hard as I could to make out something, anything. And then I saw it. Not more than 100 yards ahead was a 20-foot-high, unlit, rock-solid wall. Right there in the middle of the ocean, looming, and by this point making its presence known by the sound of waves lapping against it. I was absolutely petrified. Mind you, this was before chart plotters were widely used, and we were navigating with paper charts. I was utterly confused and supremely terrified. I called all hands on deck, and we stopped the boat dead, pulled down the sails and started the engine. Slowly, painstakingly, we picked our way through what was by the time an increasingly apparent full-on construction zone. Our charts were only 2 years old, but apparently Singapore had undergone a monumental land reclamation project, or perhaps nuclamation, since it was never there to begin with. Even once we found our way out, no one slept for the rest of the night. To this day, the image of that magically appearing dark wall in the middle of the ocean haunts my dreams. Last year I went deer hunting. I usually jump hunt, walk through the bush by myself, with a 30-30 lever action. Gone out this late and I had managed to get out into the back fields. The sun was just cresting the horizons, and at this time I usually head in, because you're not supposed to shoot an hour until dark. Well, this night I figured I'd go through the cedar groves at the back of the property, just to see if there were tracks. The property had been in my family for my whole life, and I know it like the back of my hand. Well, right as the dark crests, the coy wolves, which are about 60 to 80 ballsy guys, show up. Now I always enjoy their howling till tonight. That night, they came up behind me and I could hear 4 howl less than 50 yards away. All I had was 4 rounds in my gun and a cell phone flashlight. I start walking as quickly as I could to get through the cedars, a 45-minute ordeal, where another 4 wolves had cut me off. I never fired my gun, but they blind charged me a few times and would start going in a circle pattern, running circles around me. I'd hear them start to do the same noise as a dog on a deer hunt. Twice they brushed me and got so close. By the time I got out of the cedars, I was happy to have at least a shot, but I had an open field to cross and could hear them out on the outskirts the whole time. Also, just thinking about that with only 5 yards of sight of the cell phone light, it took me an hour to stop shaking when I got in. Driving out later that night, I could see they were following me up the driveway, and there was 21 or so tracks. On another occasion, I was staying in an old cabin, and had an interaction with Nana Bush. I was just finishing up for the night and this bird starts slamming into my window for a solid 5 minutes. It's 11 p.m. in the middle of February, and it's odd to see a bird, let alone one doing this. I don't think anything of it, and carry on till I'm ready to go to bed. Going for my bedtime smoke, I see the bird clinging to the screen door, Pushing on out, it flies at me twice and hits all the windows on that side of the house, and vanishes. And I hear something scuttle towards me, and I see a figure 3 feet tall running on 2 legs in the dark between the vehicles. I just booed out of the situation and locked the doors, and went to bed.
I had just turned 21 and frequented the bars regularly. In hindsight, I probably spent too much time drinking with my friends. I didn't have a car or cell phone, and I lived on the outskirts of town. It was a 45-minute walk downtown. The town I live in is generally a very safe place. It's a wealthy, well-to-do, white-bread community, so walking home alone at night after drinking was nothing that bothered me, other than the actual walking. It was a Tuesday night, and that meant pints were cheap, so I wouldn't say that I was completely wasted, but I certainly was more than tipsy. Instead of walking home along the sidewalk where I feared I'd be picked up by the police for being drunk in public, I decided to take the bike path that ran along the train tracks. This meant the walk would take longer, but was much safer and less likely to run into sort of trouble, or so I thought. The bike path was not very well lit, and knowing what I know now, I should have been a lot more nervous about walking alone in the complete darkness at 2 in the morning. Like I said, I had just turned 21 and was certainly an arrogant young male who was thinking about women and not minding my surroundings. I had taken this path many nights, and coming across anyone else was rare. If I did perchance come across somebody this late at night, most of the time it was just another drunk college student who had the same thoughts as me. Either that, or they were homeless. But if so, I'd say they were all harmless. So this night as I'm walking, I noticed further down the path that somebody was walking towards me. He wore a large hiking backpack and had his hoodie pulled over his head. It was so dark I couldn't see their face. I could really only just barely make out their outline. This person's gait unquestionably revealed him to be a male, who I figured was probably just a transient. It was odd to see somebody walking towards downtown at 2 in the morning. When I got really close to him, and we were about to cross the path, this person just stopped dead in his tracks, and I could tell he was staring at me because his head just followed me as I walked by. It creeped me out a bit, and I certainly felt like it was a bit odd. As I continued to walk, I shrugged at the situation. I didn't feel right. Something in my gut made me feel wrong. I stopped and turned around to see this person still staring at me. "What?" I asked him, as I stopped walking and remained to stare back to him. That's when he hissed at me like a snake. A long, vicious-sounding hiss that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I had hoped he was just being weird, or perhaps was on meth or something. I nervously laughed for a bit, and said something like, okay, and continued to walk on. I made it a few more steps and turned to look back. He somehow managed to get closer to me without making a sound, and he stood completely still. I figured perhaps I was just drunk and imagining things, and turned back around and walked, taking a few more steps. I turned around once more. Now I knew he was closer. I couldn't believe it. I could hear him approaching me. What unsettled me even more was how every time I turned around he managed to stop and stand completely still. Are you following me, buddy?" Once again he let out this creepy hiss and just stared at me. Now I was freaked out and had this strange sensation that I was some sort of prey. "Hey, piss off, man," I now yelled. In hindsight, this was a bad idea, because I already felt like I was some sort of target, and the last thing I should have been wanting to do is provoke this sick and twisted individual. I started backing away at this point, not taking my eyes off him. He just stood there hissing. The hisses were getting longer, louder, and more malice was apparent in him. As he started to hiss louder and louder, he began to engage in some sort of pursuit. At first, there were basic steps, and I backed away further. As he started to hiss louder and louder, he began to engage in some sort of pursuit. At first, they were basic steps, but the further I backed away, the more he sped up, taking bigger steps towards me. I said, "Forget this," to myself. "I'm getting out of here." I noped out of there and began into a fully fledged run, and he started running after me. I could hear his heavy boots gaining on me, hissing like a cat, growling like a dog. I feel his spit hitting me in the back of the neck. "Get away from me," I yelled, and I might have peed myself a little, I was so afraid. All I could think to do was to run as fast as I could and get inside of my house as quickly as possible. I've always been a very fast runner, but this guy was much taller than me and his legs were really long, so he was really cutting down the distance between him and me. I managed to get a good 5 between us though, checking back behind me as his arms reached out in an attempt to grab me. I finally made it out of the bike path and onto the crossing sidewalk of the street that was lit up by street lamps and a few passing cars. I was so relieved to finally make it back to civilization. There was a gas station over by my house, and I thought I'd run to the safety of its inside, only to see that the lights had been shut off and the doors were closed. It was closed. I had to make it to my house. As I got closer to my house, I could see my roommate's lights were on through the window. "Chris!" I shouted. "Chris, open the door!" I'm impressed I yelled loud enough that he actually heard me, and saw the front door to my house open up and my roommate standing at the doorway looking confused. I ran up the steps and almost jumped inside, slamming the door behind me. "Dude, what are you running from?" he asked. You don't see the guy chasing me?" "No." I ran to the window and looked out, but he was gone. I've no idea what happened to him, but I am sure that it had really happened. Whoever the guy was who hissed at me was really shaking me up, and I never walked down that bike path after dark again.
I started kayaking a few weeks ago. Every Friday my trainer Gabby and I would go kayaking on the Rhine River, and every other Monday we have training in an indoor swimming pool to improve our paddle techniques, getting out of the kayak underwater or doing the Eskimo roll. Anyway, one Friday we got out onto the Rhine River, and like always we paddled our way to a little island that is under conservation. It sits pretty much in the middle of the river, and you're not allowed to go up there. When we paddled to the bank, we spotted a backpack in the water. Naturally, we questioned how it got there. I thought someone might have been trespassing on the island and lost it, or simply littered it, but Gabby mentioned that it was more likely to be stolen, and that the valuables had been taken and the backpack then discarded across the bridge, and that it floated here until it got stuck at the bank of the island. Because we were super curious, we retrieved it, which turned out to be heavy, because it had been soaked. We took a look inside and found a few chargers, a pack of crisps, a Snickers, a notebook, calendar, and some paper that was no longer legible. We decided to take the backpack with us to inspect further. After putting all the kayak stuff away, we looked closer. Gabby found a set of keys, but we didn't see a phone or wallet, confirming Gabby's assumption that it had been stolen. I took the calendar to see if I could find any info about the previous owner, and even though it had been in the water for some time, you could still read most of the notes the man wrote down. We found quite a few appointments written down, and a confirmation of a doctor's appointment, which gave us the name of the owner. Gabby said that she would let the backpack dry, take it home and contact the doctor to let him know about finding his patient's belongings. I was unable to go kayaking next week as I was visiting my grandma, but the Monday after, we went back to training, and I wanted to ask Gabby if she had any update about the backpack, but due to traffic, she ran a bit late and I simply forgot about it. After training though, Gabby came up to me and told me that she needed to update me about the backpack story. It took me a moment to realize what she had said. The backpack owner had died. I wanted to know how she found out. Apparently she called his doctor, and she said before wanting to call him, she simply Googled the name, and what she found out was a missing persons report. The police said that if anyone knew anything about the man, to speak to them directly, so she did. I asked how she knew he was dead, and she said when the police came back and retrieved the backpack, they handed her a form saying she would let them have the backpack of the deceased person. Gabby said that she felt sick after receiving the info that the guy was dead, and that she thinks he may have ended his life because we have seen so many doctor's appointments in the calendar. We wonder if the man drowned himself with the backpack or if he just threw it in the water so something personal of his would be found, even if his remains weren't. That got me quite a bit. I had been struggling with mental illness myself and see myself as an overall empathetic person, so it was easy for me to see how the guy must have struggled. The despair he felt right before taking his own life, the void of his soul and absolute nothingness, the reason to live that he ran out of. If he had drowned himself, was it because the water gave him peace? Gabby and I still talk about it. He won't be forgotten by us. I hope from the bottom of my heart that he has now found the peace that he couldn't find while being alive. Let me take you back a few years, before the boredom that was the pandemic. This all happened at a barbecue. Remember those? My friend was having his annual barbecue. It was a beautiful summer's day, and we were all getting absolutely filled with delicious food and a little bit drunk. I'm not ashamed to admit it. While it was still light out, being the summer, my friend, the host of the party, talked about a cave in the distance. We all inquired about what was so special about the cave, and he told us that this cave in particular is said to have been the site of some pretty gruesome stuff in the past, in the war times, and that because of it, they had to put grates on the entrance. All of us lads called absolute bull and wanted to see this cave for ourselves. My friend, the host, really wanted to go exploring it, as he was convinced there was something worth seeing inside. So in our tipsy bravado, we all fetch what equipment we can to go exploring before dusk. We grab a handful of torches and start taking the 2-mile walk across random fields until we get to a small area. It was a bit like a forest, a tiny forest nestled between about 4 or 5 different fields. We get in and start looking around for the cave. My friend is ahead of us, guiding us through this little clearing, when he takes us down a hole. He explains that he believes this hole had been made by a bomb thrown during World War II. And that is when we find the grills. Nowhere near as impressive as I had originally thought. I was expecting the gates to Hogwarts or some huge thing like that, but this was a grill about 4 or 5 feet by 4 or 5 feet. Barely big enough for someone to squeeze in all honesty. We said, "Is this it?" And he goes on to tell me that he had heard in the pub from other locals that apparently horrific things had happened here, and that it used to be a research facility in the war. We all called rubbish. When we went in, we were still feeling the buzz of the party and of the alcohol, turned on our torches, and started walking in, taking a look around. It smelled damp and of animal feces. We kept on going. From a small entrance, it started to get quite bigger, to a space about the size of an average living room. As we kept going, the tunnel was getting darker, unsurprisingly, and our torches were the only source of light. We looked around. The tunnel was cut into the earth and looked like it hadn't been disturbed in an extremely long amount of time, save for the animal feces. That is when we saw something. Something was reflecting off our light. We approached it cautiously, nervous to whatever could be down there. As we got closer, and shone our torch more at it, did we realize it appeared to be a door handle. there was a door in a cave underground. Things were starting to get interesting. As we approached the door handle, the group of us all shone our lights at the door. Surely this would be locked. Were we prepared for such an eventuality? As my friend gently brought down his hand to the handle, he pulled it down, and unsurprisingly, it opened. We were all pretty happy. The door creaked open loudly, very ominous in the echoey cave. As we shined our lights, inside there appeared to be a room. This one was not made of earth, but appeared to have been made of wood, at least from the inside. Almost like someone had slotted a container with a room in it, dropped it in the ground and then filled it in. Who knows, maybe that's what happened. We started exploring. Whoever was here last had left in a hurry. There were papers, pencils, a filing cabinet, all kinds of stuff underneath the ground, and no one had ever known about it. Well, had the balls to explore it, should I say. The people who had left had certainly done so in a hurry. One of the cups of what I assumed was tea was on the ground and had actually stained the floor from where it had spilled. We weren't getting good vibes. What was this place about? We started reading some of the documents, and it definitely appeared to be from the government. We were all quite excited, but there was no treasure in here. It was just a single room. My friend started moving things around, inside the filing cabinet and such, when he pulled back a filing cabinet. And that is when he saw another grate. But this one was open. That's weird. Not cut. The grate had been propped open and was hidden behind this filing cabinet. This was just getting creepier. So one of my friends, Dan, dares someone to squeeze in. The hole was a little bit smaller than the original one, but I was fairly confident most of us could make it through. I, as Dan didn't want to, poked my head in first, scared that some land shark was going to come and bite my head off. As I turned on the flashlight and poked it around on either side, the tunnel continued. This was still made of earth, and what appeared to be another shining object in the middle towards the top. Could it be another door? Excitedly, the rest of us started making our way. What treasures? What the hell could be hidden down here? And why was it locked up and abandoned in such a hurry? Our brains were going crazy with government conspiracies and wartime nonsense. The things that they'd done in secret, human testing, stuff like the Russian sleep experiment, no doubt. All in a quiet town in rural England. We all squeezed through the hole and began approaching it carefully. It was only a short walk, and this time, when I tried the handle, it opened again. We shone our flashlight into the room, but this one smelled much worse, much mustier. It was pretty unpleasant, and I wasn't feeling so great. This room was very different from the other, with a single chair in the middle of the room, and writing all over the wall. What the hell had this been? The writing was unintelligible, in a variety of different colors. We were all astounded as to what the hell could have happened here that everyone decided to leave so quickly. We thought someone might have been locked in, but the door was unlocked. Maybe we were going to find a body. Sadly, there didn't appear to be another door here, so we were all fairly confused as to what was just going on down here, and why the solitary chair. It didn't really make much sense. So, in the end, we decided to leave it. Just as we were leaving, though, did one of my buddies, Ben, notice something on our return. Where the entrance via the hidden filing cabinet was, There was actually a small slit to the right, barely noticeable, and barely big enough for a person to squeeze through. We all looked at each other and knew that we had to do it. Lawrence was the thinnest between us, so we asked him if he wouldn't mind shining the flashlight and checking out what was in this third secret tunnel. As he took the torch, he began to squeeze through the narrow gap, torch hanging from his hand. He made it through without much effort, and when on the other side, he just said, "Oh my God," and started coming back. Of course, this just led to a barrage of questions. What are you talking about? Why are you saying that? We all in turn started to make our way in. That is when we found the third door. But this one had a glass panel, unlike the rest, and when we shone our torch into it, we could see what appeared to be a person sitting at a table facing us. Everyone jumped out their skin. But eventually, when we calmed down and noticed in the light that it didn't move, did we approach the door, go to open it, but this time it was locked. There was no key anywhere in the ground or the dirt, so we shone the torch in and just stared at it. My friend was convinced it was a mannequin. It didn't appear to have any bones or anything. It was just so unnerving to see this thing propped in a chair, as it gave us a right scare. We looked in and could see there was a door behind it, but as there was no key, and as it was getting dark outside, and the spook frightening us a considerable amount, we decided to leave the exploration for now. It's been a few years, and we haven't gone back to finish the exploration, but I often fantasize and wonder about what the hell that is and why it's down there. When I was younger, my family was extremely poor and lived in a very old mobile home on some land my grandpa owned. This piece of land was in a very small town out in the middle of nowhere in Texas, covered in wood. The town itself was your typical small country town where football was king and there was nothing to do but get drunk or high on the weekend. It was also the typical type of town, along with it being the early 90s, where one didn't typically have to worry much about locking their doors or setting an alarm. Now our trailer was a 2-bedroom, and my parents, always putting us kids ahead of themselves, slept in the living room on a fold-out couch. My room was directly connected to it, and my sister's room was down a hallway past the kitchen and bathroom at the other end of the trailer. One night after everyone had gone to bed, my dad is woken up by a feeling that there is someone in the room. He looks around a bit and sees a large male figure sitting in the easy chair just feet from the bed. My dad quickly flipped on the light next to his bed and saw it was a neighbor from down the road named Carter. Carter was known for being a frequent drug user and was often in trouble with the law because of this. My dad asked him why the hell he was there and what he was doing, and asked him to get out. "I can't," Carter replied. "The demons are chasing me. Your house is the only safe one." My dad, who I should say is fairly large and a terrifying person, responded that if he didn't get out now, the house would be a lot less safe for him. "If they leave, they'll get me. They've been chasing me all night, and if they catch me, I'm dead." My dad's response was that there was no demons, but that if he didn't get out of his house now, he would be dead. From what I've since been told, I was asleep for this part. My mum also hurled a few threats. While she may not be big, she was equally as terrifying. I believe it was her anger that finally scared him off. My dad got up and locked the doors and watched through the blinds as Carter decided, since he couldn't outrun the demons, he'd steal our old, beater Suburban that my dad always left the keys in. He drove around for an hour, and we called the police, and it took us about that long to get us out since the closest police station was about 20 or so minutes away. He finally brought it back and was arrested and taken to jail. He was deemed crazy and ended up being locked in a mental institution. The scarier part is that for years after this, we'd get phone calls where we'd all hear this music that would have lyrics like, "I'm gonna kill you." These calls lasted for years and followed us from house to house, even though we always had different numbers and would even be in different states. We always thought it was him sending us a message. The calls stopped when I was 12. I later found out that it was around the time that Carter thought the best thing to do for himself would to soak himself in gasoline and set himself on fire.
This story was relayed to me a while ago by a close friend of the family called Cliff. It takes place in the 1990s at Eels Lake, Ontario, Canada. So Cliff was out one night, making the rounds on his ATV, drinking at the local hunting camp. Sometime in the early morning, between 1 and 5 a.m., he decides to head home. When he pulled into his camp, he noticed that someone was standing out by his small woodshed, bordering a tree line. When he dismounted his ATV, this person approached him and asked to go on a nighttime walk through the woods and up to a clearing we called the mountain. He instantly recognized the voice as his wife's and agreed. At first he had to run inside and use the toilet. His wife protested, saying that he could just go in the bush along the walk and that if he went inside, he'd just rile up the dogs. Still he refused, told her to just hang on for 1 minute and ran inside to banish an eldritch horror into his septic tank. After finishing his business, he noticed that his dogs had been absent this whole time. Checking to see if they were okay, he found them both cowering under the main table of the camp. Even when he called, they wouldn't budge. They just lay under the table. Not thinking much of the situation, he headed into the bunk room to grab an extra flashlight for his wife. He recounted how glad he was that he just pooped, as when he entered the bunk room he was struck stiff as his wife was lying asleep in her bunk. After a moment of fear, he went to grab a rifle, loaded it, lit a fire, and sat inside until the sun came up. In the morning, he did a quick look around camp and didn't notice anything out of place. Nothing was stolen nor broken. He put emphasis on just how real the experience was. Whatever spoke to him sounded exactly like his wife, and even spoke like she would. It was very insistent on going into the woods that instant, but never sounded annoyed or frustrated at his rejection. He didn't get a great look at the person, but he said it was identical to her, recognizable even in the dark. And that's the story. I was just speaking to him recently and we talked about it. He's pretty sure it wasn't her. My family has been in the area for many years, and I've heard lots of strange stories about the area, but never really encountered anything myself. Was it her doppelganger? Or perhaps something more sinister, trying to lure him out, pretending to be his wife?
When I was around 10, my family took a trip to Egypt. It was sort of a half cruise down the Nile. We would stay often in various spots to check things out. I don't think we honestly travelled on the boat very far, but it's where our rooms were. My memory is a bit shaky on the finer points, as it was almost 20 years ago, but I do remember a lot of cool things we went to see and do there. The Great Pyramids, riding a camel, museums, mummies and the like. But I also remember a lot of not-so-fun things. Like the tour guide, telling my family that my mother and I could never be by ourselves without either our male family members or others from the tour group. They told us that the men in the country would see a single woman as someone seeking doing it, as they wouldn't travel alone otherwise. Or when a man tried to offer my father a herd of camels in exchange for me, and a bit less for my mother. We were horrified. On top of that, the ship we were staying at had a swimming pool. One morning as I was using it, sporting a one-piece bathing suit, there was a boat driving past where we were moored, full of men. They were hooting, hollering and applauding, and making a general ruckus as they could see me. And I put on theatrics because of it, diving in the pool, strutting around, loving the attention. I cringe at this now. Years later, my mother told me how in a store selling souvenirs on the shore, she was groped by the seller. He was placing a necklace on her and gave one of her breasts a really invasive feel. She told my father and he shrugged it off, and she was still mad at him over it. I understand. I would be too. And to this day, I remember the one morning my parents went to go watch the sunrise over the desert. It required a very early wake-up, and my brother and I declined on going. So while my parents were out in the desert looking at the sun, my brother still sleeping, I decided to go to the pool. This may have been the same day that I was catcalled, since I was in the pool area by myself, but I'm not 100% sure. I do remember that on the top of that ship, there was a hatch going down one level near the pool. That day I eyed it, and decided I had to know where it went. It was easy to open, and I climbed down a short ladder to the deck below. The deck was still open to the outside, with doors leading to compartments and such. The way the boat was moored, we had a couple of ships out from the port. To get off the boat, you'd have to traverse the other ships in between. But I think this was a normal thing. We were all lined up together, and the travelers would simply disembark by going through various ships until reaching shore. I went right when I reached the ladder bottom, noticing the major differences from the others around the boat I'd been on. The area was dirtier, and there were ropes and other junk lying around. I think that's where the kitchens were, and I stood a while looking through the window. I remember it seemed rather gross looking in there, which redoubled my desire to never eat there. I went back towards where the ladder was, then continued for a bit. From this vantage I could see all the ships between ours and the shore. I think maybe 4 in total, and I noticed the far ship that a man was hopping over the railings and coming towards me, one boat at a time. This is versus coming through the main area, which had been set up for the tourists to easily get through all the ships to go to shore. I backed up a bit towards the ladder and realized he was making a beeline towards me. He came over the railing, and I don't remember what exactly he said to me, but it was an introduction in heavy accented English. He asked me if I wanted to party. I was a little confused in my head, because party is when my parents had friends over, and there's lots of music and dancing. I liked parties. I don't remember exactly how he convinced me, but I remember standing in the open doorway to the cabin where he was inviting me in. It smelled like smoke, and there was still haze all throughout the room. 3 men in traditional garb, like flowing dress shirts that they were wearing, were sitting around smiling, waving their hands at me. A hookah nearby, bottles everywhere. Outside the room, the sun was shining and everything was bright and lit up. There was an underlying smell I couldn't place, smoke drifting, and the blinds were shut, giving the room a reddish tinge. Out of everything, the memory that is most vivid is I remember looking up at the time to see a smiling, moustached man standing in the doorway. He wasn't intimidating, a bit scrawny in fact. My little prepubescent brain did light up though. I went, I'm pretty sure this is one of these situations I'm not supposed to be in, and I really need to get the hell out of here now. So I booked it, turned tail, and skedaddled to the ladder as it wasn't far. I didn't look back a single time. I just got to the ladder as fast as I could and ran back to our room that my brother was still in, still sleeping. I told my parents after they returned, and they made a complaint, but nothing ever came of it. The room in question was just a crew member's lounge or something, but I never saw those guys again. My parents left Egypt disgruntled. I never really thought about it again until years later when I was older. Would I be dead by now? Sold into a trafficking ring? Married to some Egyptian guy with a bunch of kids? It makes me shudder to think about. And I'm grateful that my school did cover a little, although not enough, stranger danger. It was enough to make me reject the very friendly guy and realize it was a bad situation. With all the weird situations that happened on that trip, and the fascination I apparently held for being so young, I can't help but feel that something terrible would have happened if I'd have gone to that room. When I was a teenager, my friends and I liked to go exploring uninhabited islands. They're called the 1,000 Islands in the Indian River Lagoon. We camped, played paintball, all pretty innocent stuff. One day we decided to explore a new island for a fresh spot. We found a big one, so to save time, I was inserted on the southern end to explore while the others canoed around the island to see what was there. The plan was for me to meet them on the north side. That did not happen. The island was hell. Brambles. Bush so thick I had to crawl through the muck. The perimeter was a swamp with dead trees and God knows what lurking under the film of green algae. And then there were the skeletons. As I crawled my way up the island, I came upon skeleton after skeleton. Turtles, raccoons, deer. That's when it hit me. This is an alligator heaven. I freaked out and made a break for the open water, not wanting to die. I yelled out as loud as I could, and fortunately my friends heard me and paddled ferociously out to me. I had made it only 1/3 of the way up the island, and was thankfully extracted. We named that one Hell Island, and never returned. Looking back on it, I think we got very lucky. We camped/canoed in places alligators bred, and got bitten to hell during the West Nile outbreak. It was fun though. Some years ago when I was 8, my grandfather took me fishing in a little motorboat a couple of miles offshore in the Atlantic. After an hour with nothing caught, he started the return trip and turned the motor on. But no luck. After 15 minutes of effort, and cursing the likes of which I've never heard, he undid the clamp holding the motor on and dropped it to the bottom of the ocean. Then he started rowing back. He popped out a mile offshore, and we were being carried rapidly towards some exposed rocks. A large motor yacht approached. I started jumping up and down screaming. Gramps told me to sit down and shut up. Apparently the law of the sea meant that if you ask for help, the person giving aid can claim your boat. So we waited until they offered help and got towed in. We almost died because Gramps was willing to scuttle his motor, but not his boat.
I was solo pitching for a long weekend in the Pacific Northwest, and one day was in the rare part of the trail that is closer to civilization, so there was a higher chance of other hikers and campers being around. I saw 1 or 2 people, but was mostly from afar, and as it was nightfall soon and getting cold, and I was getting deeper into the woods, I knew the odds of seeing someone else were highly unlikely. I was hiking around a small pond, and was going to set up camp nearby when I heard some shuffling noise behind a small rock/boulder. It was a repetitive noise and got louder and then quieter, but never stopped at all, and basically, if you're a regular hiker, you know a noise that does not fit the woods when you hear it. I took out my 2 knives that I carry when hiking and slowly walked around the boulder, honestly not knowing what I'd see. What I did not expect to see, and was very shocked to see, was a very attractive couple in their 20s going right at it aggressively on a blanket. Obviously they were as shocked as I was to come upon someone else, and they freaked out and yelled, as did I, and as they covered their bodies into their clothes in a panic, I awkwardly apologized, picked up my gear and sort of just jogged off into the woods, passing their tent that they had pitched along the way. Also in another part of the country, I thought I saw a bear once, and it turned out to be a giant pile of mud. I wonder if that couple is still together, and if they tell the story when they get drunk at parties like I do.
I was in Bermuda in the off-season, with my parents and little brother. I must have been about 5. I remember the hotel was empty, and a man with a red vest shirt got me some milk. The beach was empty. Just so you know, most of this place was empty. Cheaper for us, perhaps, to go. I was on the beach with my parents, and my 2 to 3-year-old brother was with them. I ran off to explore, and saw my mum on the beach. "Come on, Nate." There was a thick area of scrubby bushes and trees along the beach. She went up to it. There was this cement square with pipes or vents or something coming out of it. She stood there, then saw me coming and kept walking into the thicket. I thought something was wrong, but didn't want to be defiant. So, I pretended I was really interested in the pipe thing and said out loud, "I wonder what those are for." So if she got mad, I could say I was interested in the pipes or something and not just disobey. As soon as she went out of view into the thicket, my dad came up from the beach into where I was and yelled, "What have you been doing? Don't wander off like that." He took my hand roughly and led me back to the beach where my mother and brother were. I still don't know what the hell happened. The woman looked exactly like my mum, but just felt wrong.
I live in rural Western Canada and have been hiking in the swamps all my life. I almost never run into people, but all kinds will drive out here to dump their trash. Lots of poachers too. I almost never find trash deep in the woods. It's mostly near roads. I've gone on many night walks as well, but saw nothing odd on those. When I was a child, my brother and I found a skinned bear with no head dumped in the ditch. We live out in the boonies, so I suppose the poachers thought it was an okay place to dump it. It certainly gave us a real fright. We thought it was a human at first. The skinned bear hands look pretty human, especially if you don't know any better. I've seen a dead boar inside of a dumped freezer. This one was really wild to me, because I've never seen a boar in my life. We don't get them wild up here, so it must have been from a farm, too lazy to dispose of it properly. It had hair and tusks. I've also seen ribs inside of a dumped washing machine, too small to be human. I once found a trash bag beside a tree that had a cross etched into it, and there was a cat in it. I suppose they couldn't be bothered to give their cat a burial, but the cross was a nice touch. Aside from that, I've seen bear and moose, and I hear about people saying if you smell garbage in the woods, it's a Sasquatch. If you smell death and trash, I bet money that it's a grizzly, and you should go home, because they can smell you roughly 30 kilometers away against the wind. If you can smell them, they already know you were there a long time ago. Be safe, and always carry bear mace and tell someone where you're going. Have a compass, and make some noise when you're out. While cougars are dangerous, they are rare and spook easily. A bear or moose is much more likely to cause you harm. Coyotes are almost always harmless unless they've been breeding with wolves. I think there's only one confirmed death from coyotes in Canada. Coy wolves that were guarding food. If you don't know anything about bears and are planning to go hiking where they are prevalent, please look up bear safety and never feed the bears. They might just take you as their next meal as well.
I'm from Bay of Catal and have a sailing boat which I ride with my family almost every day in summer. At one time around 8 p.m. we were in the middle of the bay sailing home. The thing was, the bay was surrounded by mountains, so it was pretty dark, even if it was 8 p.m. Out of nowhere this big wave starts appearing right next to us, and they appeared to be the kind of waves that were made from a boat. However, there were no big boats near us. On the last wave, I accidentally looked up and saw this big wooden sail, bigger than my entire boat. I instantly looked down and saw this huge 18th century boat. And the moment I looked at it, it faded from existence along with the waves. It doesn't sound that scary in retrospect, but when you're out on the deep sea and experience something like this, it would freak anyone out.
When I was young and adventurous, my boyfriend and I would go four-wheeling deep in the mountains and set up dry camps. There were rough trails for driving, but we were truly remote, and no cell coverage or other means of communication were available. We're in the tent sleeping until we hear a vehicle. We think they'll drive past, but they stop and sit there with their engine on and lights off. We look outside. It's a dark van, no side windows, and looks sketchy as hell. We stay in the tent watching to see if anyone's gonna get out and try something. We were armed because, America.
So I got to sit there for 20 minutes waiting for this van full of idiots or criminals to decide whether they're going to keep driving or not. They finally left, and so did we, as soon as we got packed up. Took us 4 hours of driving through the mountains in the dark to get back on the highway and grab a hotel room. That was the last time I ever went out alone like that.
I've been fishing out in the Gulf of Mexico where they have some oil rigs. This rig wasn't being used from what we knew, so we got up pretty close to it to fish for red snapper. While we were out there, we could have sworn we heard the screams of a woman over and over. It was hard to explain. We thought it was just the wind making noises through the rig. Well, that's what we were told, but it creeped us the hell out. I'm from Slovakia, a little state in Central Europe. I had lived there for 20 years, and I never heard about this topic until quite recently. You see, there's a very strange forest in the westish part of the country, named Tribech. First time I ever found out about the place was from a movie trailer about the topic. I was bamboozled when they wrote it was based on true events. Like, this is a small country, and people are kind of conservative. But anyway, nothing much ever happened in our country that I would consider paranormal by any means. I discovered that there's an almost Bermuda Triangle kind of place with a big twist. You see, people mysteriously disappear, but they also appear weeks, even months later, in completely different locations, disoriented, with severe cuts and burns on their hands and legs. The cuts are completely different sizes and depths. It's important to mention, people are not always found, but if they are, this state of disorientation or insanity is very common. Allegedly, this little spot, this forest in the middle of nowhere, is full of crosses with scary, unexplained pasts, abandoned villages left to decay, castle ruins no one can remember. It's a very favorite, famous tourist attraction, but people, even though they know nothing about the place, are reporting feeling lost, disoriented, losing track of time, disappearing and reappearing in places they'd never been. They even start going missing. The season tends to happen between November and March. Even the Slovakian media covered these stories several times, but not frequently. The most famous case I can remember is about a German man named Walter Fischer. He went into the forest for a hike to Black Castle. He never returned, so his wife went to the police to search for him. And months didn't go by, but a year later he was found in another part of this forest, bleeding with several weird burns on his body. He was taken to hospital, and from there to a psychiatric unit, because he went totally bananas and was blabbering about lights that kept him company, about different dimensions, and other stuff like that. Bear in mind he was completely normal before he stepped foot into the forest. The latest story, as far as I'm aware, was from 2017, when a boy was lost and they found him after several weeks, injured and fainted. He was brought to the hospital, but passed due to his injuries. He had cuts on his hands and bare feet, as he had somehow lost his boots. This is very strange, and reminiscent of the 411 cases if you guys are familiar. All I'm saying is if you guys find yourselves in Slovakia, it might be best to stay out of the woods. A few years ago, my dad, my brother-in-law, my best friend and myself were tasked with refueling a group of 8
that was hiking the John Muir Trail. For some reason, we were recommended a trail that would be a shortcut, and only 6 miles to the lake that would become our base camp. We later found out it was about 6,700 feet of elevation gain. The trail starts off on the eastern side of the Sierras, which is essentially the desert. So in order to beat the August heat, we started on the trail at 3 a.m. Our packs were all loaded, tipping the scales at over 50 pounds each, which was our gear, food, and week's supply of food for the 8 we were refueling. The first couple of miles were made up of super sandy switchbacks. By the time the sun came up, we were all out of water, despite the fact that we had packed extra, because we knew there wasn't a source for the first few miles. As dehydration started to set in, we encountered a small section, maybe 100 yards of trail, that was almost completely washed out. The main issue was that it was only about 12 inches wide of slippery granite, with a vertical wall on one side and an easily 500-foot drop straight to the valley floor on the other. This was the first point on the hike where I feared for our lives, but we made it. Once we passed this point, we entered the tree line and found a creek for water. We kept moving up what seemed to be vertical trail for the next few hours, until we reached a meadow and another source of water. We came across a guy who told us he had just found a dead body, an apparent suicide, in a tent just up the trail. Creeped out, we pumped our water filters as fast as we could and continued up the trail. For the next few hours we marched up switchbacks, until the point that I heard my dad, who had fallen a little behind, scream out for me. I dropped my pack and sprinted on my noodle legs back down the trail where I found him. He was curled up in the fetal position in a puddle of his own vomit. He kept saying he wanted to take a quick nap, and I thought for sure I was going to watch him pass there. After regathering ourselves and letting him rest for a bit, we started to move again. At this point, we were once again low on water, but the map indicated we were fairly close to a lake. I kid you not, when we finally got to the lake, it was completely dry. We continued on to our resting point, only to find that my brother-in-law, as he moved quicker while I stayed with my dad, was nearly incapacitated because he sprained his knee. We all slept like logs, and the next day my dad and I hiked the other group supplies the final leg of the trail to the rendezvous point, while the other two stayed back at base camp because of the knee sprain. On our way to the rendezvous point, we crossed paths with 3 guys who looked like they'd come straight out of the 70s. They informed us the trail we were coming up on is really only recommended for going out. The 3 of us then proceeded to strip down, frolic and sunbathe at Base Camp Lake as we moved up the trail. After our whole crap storm of a backpacking trip, we get back to the trailhead where we find my dad's car won't start and won't take a jump from the car we had taken, and ended up needing an alternator. The good news is that we were able to refuel the other group, and we all survived. However, we collectively look back at this near-death experience, and words will never truly explain what happened.